So welcome to the Concordia University Wargame Design Speaker Series. I'm Dr. Julian Spencer-Churchill on behalf of the Strategic and Diplomatic Society, the Undergraduate Political Science Students Association. And the topic of the series is great wargame design, essentially interviewing the leading designers of some of the most innovative wargames. I'm very happy to have adjunct professor Mark Herman joining us today. And I'm going to quickly read a bio. Professor Herman is a prolific wargame designer who started working at SPI in 1976 and was CEO of Victory Games. Professor Herman holds a bachelor's degree in history from the State University of New York at Stony Brook and a master's degree in national security studies from Georgetown University. He was a senior partner for Booz Allen Hamilton and was a leader in the fields of wargaming, modeling, simulation, strategic planning, and analysis work. His 1983 design Gulf Strike, which covered the Iran-Iraq War and a US-led defense of Saudi Arabia, was used in the initial US analytic efforts at the beginning of the Gulf War in August of 1990. Herman, along with Booz Allen principals Mark Frost and Robert Kurz, are co-authors of Wargaming for Leaders, Strategic Decision-Making from the Battlefield to the Boardroom, published by McGraw-Hill in 2008. He has also co-authored books on military history and a number of strategy articles on robotic and cyber warfare. He's been an adjunct professor teaching military strategy and analytic methods for Georgetown University and has also taught and lectured for the US Naval War College and the University of Maryland. His father was a frogman in the US Navy. He also runs the building for the Marshall Chess Club in Greenwich Village in New York City. The Marshall Chess Club, founded in 1915 by a group of players led by Frank Marshall, is the second oldest chess club in the United States. Now, I'd like to present some of the simulations. So I'm going to share screen. There we go. So my first acquaintance with Professor Herman was with the Battle for Jerusalem, one of the earliest game designs that he engineered. This is Pacific War, which was frankly an epic simulation of the Pacific conflict, and it allowed for very detailed conduct of naval operations on basically a daily timescale, which was unprecedented, and allowed for a great deal of realism and the integration of naval operations with air operations and the land campaigns of the conflict. This is a play of Gulf Strike at Concordia University with multiple players for each country. And you can imagine the amount of detail in the game, allowing for the detailed breakdown of command for each of the countries. This is Aegean Strike, which is a follow-on to that game, essentially a brigade level game with 25 kilometers to the hex, very detailed formation and logistics rules, which allowed for realistic representation of air combat in conjunction with land combat, air combat, and scene combat and special forces. Flashpoint Golan is particularly salient because the counter battery strike system essentially anticipated the current conflict in Ukraine in terms of the importance of indirect fires. And there's a whole chapter that focuses entirely on the strike missions and the counter strike missions and the counter strike missions, all built around the ability to sense, the use of sensors to identify the source of the fire. Professor Herman, of course, started the card-driven system with We the People, which essentially allowed for a more historical approach to conflict. And pedagogically, it's been very useful because students, when they play these games, they see the historical event and not simply a sterile movement of forces. And so this brings us to my two favorite of his card-driven games. Again, pedagogically very powerful because they bring in historical dilemmas. And in particular, the two games I was interested in as a political scientist were those that showed how negotiations during wartime shaped the peace that came after. And they explain to a large extent why things were the way they were at the conclusion of the Second World War. This is important because very often we think of history as inevitable, but in fact, you have elite players making very difficult decisions, representing multifarious interests and having to balance off various foreign policy trade-offs. And so there's of course Churchill, which looks at the various conferences during the Second World War, and Versailles, which again, it's a fascinating look at a conflict that most people don't know that much about. But to some extent, we could argue that the First World War has had a bigger impact shaping the world than the Second World War. And this particular simulation brings you through all of the complicated details of the collapse of empire and the revolution in Russia and the various negotiations around the dismantling of German colonies and the setting up of new colonies. So, stop sharing. So just a quick reminder on the format. We'll have a 30-minute presentation by Professor Herman on the philosophy of wargame design, and then 30 minutes of Q&A, and then we'll take a 15-minute break, and then we'll have a much longer discussion about simulating the standoff over Taiwan and other issues in the Pacific littoral, and of course, we might have a discussion about Ukraine. So again, thank you so much, Professor Herman, for joining us this evening. I'm looking forward to your insights on war game design.
Okay, it looks like we have a small audience, so but we'll get going anyway. So first off, I am really a professional historian who designs war games. I've always felt that you know, one could always write, if you're a historian, you could write a book, but I find that war games, historical war games, have been a better venue for my interests and for how I like to discuss and interact with history as a general rule. I thank Julian for such a nice and long introduction. But let me sort of get into the topic here and see where we can go. So first of all, I am not a video game designer. I was born in a black and white world. I did, when I was young, I did learn how to program chips, you know, the actual chips, but, you know, then there was all these other languages and all that. So I never really followed down the path that my old friend Sid Meier's went down, which was certainly made him a lot more successful you know, video game designer than board game designer. But the point is that I always ask a simple question, you know, what are manual games good for? I mean, you know, why does not use computers or whatever? And this is a quote, I didn't write it, it was from a paper I read years ago. It said, war games approximate and illuminate the human dimension of warfare. All else is commentary. And I think that that's really my best view. I think it says it very eloquently. And, you know, I've been asked by the U.S. Department of Defense on many occasions to evaluate proposals or papers or analytics. And the one that I'll actually go to, which is kind of interesting, and I'll sort of go back into this thing, what are manual games good for, is I was asked to evaluate a series of papers written by the RAND Corporation, and they had done a whole lot of detailed work on what they were calling, you know, they were worried about a potential invasion of the Baltic states. And they were looking at this situation where, you know, what would 6 NATO brigades in, you know, the Baltics do? Would that be enough to, you know, defeat a Russian attack of the Baltics? And And they were using a war game matrix to try to figure out, was 6 brigades enough? And I offered in my rebuttal to their paper that it was irrelevant. That if, and I said it happened to be Putin at the time, it said if Putin decides to invade the Baltic states, as the first NATO battalion is getting on the plane to fly to the Baltics, that's when he would invade. He won't let 6 brigades get there before he attacks, if he's going to attack. That was my take on it. And I haven't seen anything from the Ukraine war that would disagree with that. So the point of the war game is to illuminate human behavior, not try to come up with another way of doing what a computer could do rather well, of just smashing tanks and things in a simulation together. And what I've often said is that war games are to modeling and simulation what anthropology is to mathematics. In other words, I see manual war games as being more anthropology than mathematics, because you're looking at the behavior of groups and how they react to situations, and that's really where the real value is. And we always talk about in war games that players gain insights, and so I defined an insight as a human participant reaching a first order conclusion based on experiences and information uniquely produced in the war game. So in other words, humans can take in new information and not do anything with it. It's just not, and certainly the kind of people that are on this call and that we all deal with. And so an insight is like you had this experience and all of a sudden you have a new lexicon to talk about that particular thing. And as we will talk about, a potential Taiwan, and I'll be talking about Ukraine because I'm doing some work on that, those are the things that war games get to. But the big question ultimately in the Taiwan situation, going back to this point, is Xi ever going to attack? I mean, that's, if Xi's not going to attack, how do you make him, or how do you convince him not to attack? And what are the levers? But once he's attacking, this is a, all hands on deck kind of situation for the world at that point. It's not going to be some minor thing. And a lot of that has to do with the economics of chip making in some cases. What do they call it? The Taiwan Semiconductor. I get it's a company that has 4 letters in it, but it's the one that makes the most advanced chips in the world, who's now building a new plant in the United States. They say they're doing it for expansion purposes. I'm saying they're doing it for business continuity. And if the island gets hit, that plant won't survive any look what's happening in Ukraine. Nothing's going to survive a modern war of infrastructure. There's no chance that China could invade Taiwan and somehow this complex of very advanced plans that have very complex human capital and supply chains is going to be up and running ever again, or at least not for years once there was some kind of conflict. So, these are the kind of things that start to come into a discussion about that topic. But moving on, I also want to introduce the idea of what I call convergent evolution. I happen to have straddled 2 different worlds, and in biology, which happens to was potentially one of my degrees in undergraduate, the convergent evolution of biology is the appearance of apparently similar structures in organisms of different lines of descent. So in other words, you could have 2 different animals that look similar. I mean, in many ways, they have, both have flippers or whatever the heck it is. And you find out that, well, one's a mammal and one's a fish. They do similar things, but they come from very different paths to get to that location. And I would offer that DoD serious war games that, I've done in the Pentagon, and the board games that look just like those in a lot of ways have very, very, very different lineages. They come at it, the primary purpose of a commercial war game is ultimately entertainment. I mean, that's why people they're entertained by it. Now, the fact that it has all of this information and complex decisions is the entertainment. I mean, that's the entertainment value. A DoD war game doesn't come at it from a entertainment value, although sometimes the format is more lugubrious, if you could say that correctly, to people's thinking, kind of smooths things along and kind of gives them a perspective on things, but ultimately it has a very different, but they look the same. And so, so to give you an example, Julian mentioned a game I did called Churchill. And, there have been, if you're in the Pentagon and you're doing a negotiation game, you negotiate. I mean, I once did a series of exercises for the U.S. State Department and Department of Defense, and it was on just developing memorandums of understanding around what happens in a non-combatant evacuation. So we're not even talking about combat. It's like, if something goes wrong in some location in the world, well, who's in charge of doing what to get, the Americans and another potentially European or other foreign nationals out of the country safely. And ultimately the simplest way to get people out of a country is you just land a commercial air, you charter a plane, you land it and say, anybody who wants to leave, get on the plane. And if there's no shooting or anything bad happening, they'll get in the plane and they're gone. And that's the end of the problem. The worst case is you're sending in, US Marines off of a helicopter carrier, basically making a perimeter of the air, capturing the airport and putting a perimeter, very much like how we got out of Afghanistan, which was, not very pretty. But that's the other side of the non-combatant evacuation. That's the far end of it with, terrorists blowing people up and killing Marines and people jumping onto planes as they take off and falling on the ground. And I mean, that kind of chaos is the one end. The other end is you just get on a plane and come home. And that's the end of it. So I've worked on those things. Now in Churchill, the negotiation, so as was mentioned, I was a senior partner at a consulting company. And if I had been in 2,000 meetings, I've been in 3,000 meetings. I couldn't even tell you over a 27-year career there that how many meetings I've been in. And the mechanic in Churchill, and some people love it, some people hate it. That's all. Remember, I said it's entertainment, so that people are not being entertained. They'll tell you about it. But what was happening was I would be in a room, and let's say it was some human resource issue. It doesn't matter. In fact, I'll remember one where we were going to change how we handled sick leave. That's kind of we used to have an unlimited sick leave policy at the company, and then we found out that 15% of the people were basically using it to not work. They had personal issues and they basically were not working very much. And so we felt that that was unfair to the other majority of the staff that was treating it very properly. They took off when they were sick. And so we were coming up with a new policy. And so we're in a room, we're discussing it. So now imagine the issue is, we're going to go from unlimited sick leave to some other policy, whatever it is. And so somebody like myself who knows really pretty much nothing about HR would say, hey, I think it's unfair if we do it this way. And then somebody else, and so the room's going, yeah, Mark's right. I mean, that makes sense. We should be fair. And then somebody from HR who actually knows what the heck they're talking about goes, well, no, there's this legal problem, there's this and there's that. And all of a sudden the room, you can feel the room shift back to, oh, wow, Mark's an idiot, but hey, this is the real stuff. And then it would go back and forth like that. And so in Churchill, you're actually using cards to move an issue towards you or away from you. People are trying to pull it toward them to gain control of it, which is really what the mechanic is trying to do. And then there's the presidents. You got Churchill, and Julian tells me that he's a distant relative of Winston. And so Winston would sit in the meeting and he'd be listening, and Winston would say, whatever the heck that was, and everybody goes, oh, well, that's the answer. Everything else stopped, and the only person who could overrule Winston would be FDR or Stalin. So that's all built into this negotiation tactic. So here you have a negotiation tactic that comes from a totally based on a model out of corporate world, as supported by Churchill's actual writings. But that's what's going on there in this convergent evolution. But so you can do it seriously. You could do an MOU for a non-combatant evacuation, or you can use it to simulate the conferences of World War II. But again, very different purposes coming to the same basic idea of a negotiation. So continuing on, by the way, this is it, right? There's only 3 people on here, Julian, Tony, and Brianna, right? So if you guys have any questions, please just ask them, turn your microphone on and just ask them. It would be silly to do it otherwise. So I was talking to Julian and he said to me, I would really love to be in a D&D war game. I said, well, what kind? So I have, like I said, I had a long career doing this, and I have a list of 7 different kinds of games that I've run in the Pentagon. So for instance, there was what I would call a budget planning exercise, what we call a build and use, okay, what kind of here's the budget. You want to redo the budget? What are you doing? What do we got to pay for? What are we getting rid of? And all that kind of stuff. Then there's war plans testing. Now, those tend to be the most classified, so we're not going to talk about them a lot, but you can imagine what a war plan test would look like and we go over, it's a war game, right? Then there's what I call technology implementation. I work for DARPA, which stands for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which is a very famous, R&D center for the United States DoD. And I used to work with technologists trying to figure out, from basic technologies, what can we do that will make things better? And what does the field need? And it's a whole process. And I won't go into all the different kinds of money that get used, but there's really a lot of detail around R&D and how it goes from like what somebody's doing in a pure research in MIT or some other place like that, or Los Alamos, and then ultimately it turns into like a tank, or a piece of a tank. Give you an example. On the roof of this building I used to work out of, but for DARPA, there was a parking lot, and at the back of the parking lot there was like a bunch of trees. And they were working on a foliage, that means, looking through leaves, penetration radar. And so what they did was they put a robot, when I say a robot, it was a wheeled vehicle that would go back and forth across the roof, looking out past the parking lot. And they got the Army to put an M113, which is an armored personnel carrier, and they put an old tank out there, and they had some kind of anti-aircraft thing. So they had like 7 or 8 different kinds of military vehicles on their property at the back end of the thing behind the trees. And so and this thing went back and forth 365, every single day, every single minute. And of course, what happens over the course of the year is right now here in the Northeast, it's fall. So the leaves are coming off the trees, and winter, there'll be no leaves on the trees. Then the spring comes and the summer comes. And so you're getting data on the radar, how it reacts and what it can see through the trees based on all the different conditions you're going to see over the course of the year as just pure research. And so that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Ultimately, if a foliage penetration radar ends up on some aircraft, that was the beginning of it and how it went on from there. And as it turns out, one of the biggest problems with foliage penetration is water. Water is does a really good job of muting out radar. And that's, and of course, all planes have water in them. So, so one of the reasons what we tried to do in Vietnam, which was, an economic disaster, we dropped Agent R and get rid of all the foliage so we could see, what's going on underneath the leaves by getting rid of the leaves. But that's, that's how thinking, moves along in the Pentagon. Then there was what I call interagency coordination. And again, as I mentioned already, non-combatant evacuation would be in that particular issue. Then there's what I call defense program evaluation. I worked on a program I worked on the V2 program, and which we used to call euphemistically behind everybody's back the Save the Whale program. And, we mentioned get 21 B2s. I think they've lost a couple. They've lost 2 to crashes. So I think there's only 19 of them now, but they built 21 or 22 of them. I think it was 21, but they lost 2 since then. So we only have 19 of them left. But that's well known. Then there's staff professional training. What you find out is that DoD has something called Title 10. And Title 10 is like, this many pages long. It literally tells you what the department is responsible for. And every time Congress passes a law, so you might not know, but the U.S. Secretary of Defense is responsible to report to Congress on breast cancer in the military. I mean, there was a law, you got to put out a report, and other things like, what they can do with, train, maintain, and equip forces and all that other stuff. However, deep in there is training responsibilities, and some of them are sort of obscure. And so you often find at the end of an 8-year presidential term, when you have the same crew in the Pentagon, right around the very end, there's like a list of things that all of a sudden there's all these weird training exercises on various topics that they finally have to get to because it wasn't important enough until they were getting ready to walk out the door. So now they, check all the blocks and, there's a bunch of that stuff. And then there's what used to be called a BODSAT, and now they call them, it used to be a bunch of guys sitting around a table, which is a traditional view of a war game, but you saw the picture of the students sitting around a Gulf Strike map. So it kind of looks like that, right? A bunch of people sitting around. And now they call them BOTSATs, so it's people, not guys. Although guys is non-generic, but it's a more PC term, I guess. But that's what they've changed it to. And so those are sort of the ones that I've worked on. There's not many other kinds that I can think of, but who knows? So that is sort of what war games are in the Pentagon. And if I move on to commercial manual historical games. And I want to make a distinction between a historical game, which is like the Pacific War, and a conflict game. Star Wars is about a war, right? If you haven't seen the movie, you know, there's rebels and there's bad guys, and you know, it's a big soap opera, but it's about a war, but it's not a historical war game, it's a war game. So I want to be clear that war games covers a big, you know, there's apples and oranges, but they're all fruit. War games are like fruit, and there's just a lot of different apples and different kinds of fruit under that wargaming tree. And one of them would be, you know, science fiction wars of various kinds. But going back to one of the biggest problems you have using commercial manual historical war games in professional circles, like you know Julian has done and I've done, is that it requires the user without a computer to actually learn how to play the game. And some of these games, certainly the ones I've done, sometimes can have, you know, 60 pages of rules. And most people don't want to do 60 pages of rules. They don't even want to read a book, let alone an article, let alone 60 pages of rules. So you always have that disconnect, and that's why computer simulations tend to work better in the military, just because you know you don't have to teach them an interface and they're off and running. On the other hand, they don't learn what's going on because they don't know what's behind the, you know, it's like the Wizard of Oz. Don't talk to the man behind the curtain. So again, you have that particular situation. And so again, what I've often said is if you want to do wargaming in the classroom, you really need to have a course about it. You're trying to jam. I've taught for many years as an adjunct professor, and Julian, I'm sure, would say when you have a very tight curriculum, and then you try to throw a 2 or 3 session 45-minute war game into your curriculum, it plays havoc with the syllabus, and so that doesn't work. And again, doing it on weekends, which is something that Julian has done and I've done in the past, or you have a course that's developed. I ran a course for the United States Army around just teaching what we call a major, an 04 in the United States, 04s in the Army who were on their way to being, you know, 05s. And in fact, when I taught the course, several of the people in the class became 05 promotables. That means they didn't pin on yet, but they were going to be lieutenant colonels. So, you know, that was a course I taught. It was all about teaching them how to understand war games, and that was what the course's intent was. And so I had no troubles. And so now the question is, and I guess we're at the 30-minute mark or so there, Julian. Maybe I can go a little bit. I can go as long as you want, but maybe I would like to hear before I move on to you know, talking about you know, ultimately we're going to do later. If there's any Q&A, you know, let's just sort of pick it up here, and then I can talk through more.
May I pick up actually a discussion that we had before today about something that you anticipated. It was a discussion I think the people that are watching this should know. For in Flashpoint Golan, you proposed a system of strikes and counterstrikes, essentially very sophisticated system and a very accurate system of indirect fires that would have a tactical consequence. And it anticipated what we see today with HIMARS, particularly its ability to interfere with Russian logistics. Now, in your designer's notes for Flashpoint Golan, you had initially intended it, I believe, for Central Europe. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, you then repurposed it for the Israeli-Syrian situation in the Golan. Could you please share with us, because you were essentially unprecedented in making a choice, or rather, you made a decision that this actually did matter when other authors did not. And so we spoke about this. Could you please share with us your thinking that led to that discovery of this relationship? And of course, it's about timing. And then your implementation of it in the simulation.
Sure. I mean, so, you know, you'll find that one of my favorite authors was Mishner, and you know, he started his book Hawaii by telling you when the volcano started, you know, 10,000 years ago in the bottom of the ocean. So the way this story would work is back in the very early 80s, the Russians, the Soviets then, you know, they were Soviets then, wrote a bunch of papers talking about a reconnaissance strike complex. That was their terminology. And they were saying that we were doing it. And a guy named Andy Marshall, who I was my mentor and, you know, almost my surrogate father, he started working on this thing called sorry about that. called the RMA, the Reconnaissance, the Revolution in Military Affairs was his take on the reconnaissance strike system. And a reconnaissance strike system, to give you a good example, was anti-carrier warfare. So the Soviets had a submarine called an Oscar. They had like an Oscar 1, Oscar 2, but the main point of an Oscar was to fire cruise missiles. And, being a submarine, it's, tended to be quiet under the water, and they used to shadow our carriers. And the Soviets deployed these two kinds of satellites. One was called a RORSat, and the other one was called an electro-optical sat. So they had these two satellites, and they flew in tandem, and they had a real soda straw kind of path. But the idea was that they would see the carrier somehow, and the submarine had a special antenna that would take directly from the satellites the feed. So they didn't have to go through some long bureaucracy back in Moscow. And if they were in war conditions, the satellite would supposedly go overhead, the Oscar would get the data, and they would immediately launch cruise missiles at the carrier. And so that was what a reconnaissance strike complex looked like to them. Whether it worked or not isn't the important point, is that they thought it through. And we've developed, tons of that stuff. And so the RMA was looking at all of these relationships of basically sensors to things. And then I wrote a paper called Munitions-Based Warfare, where I said, it no longer matters what you can have a 707 as long as it can drop, cruise missiles or fire rockets, and those rockets are tied to some kind of sensor system. You just need something to carry something. So you didn't need to have very expensive, platforms to drag long-range munitions around. And then there was concept like the Arsenal, and then the guy that I worked with, Admiral Sobrowski, turned that into, systems-based warfare. And so, it just evolved. It was more about the information getting to the munition, getting to the target. So, as that is preamble, as we all know, there was a Gulf War in the 1990s, and as a friend of mine who used to be, in fact, this guy's name was Colonel Daniels, and he was actually the guy on the weekend who wrote out the entire war plan for the Grenada invasion, because nobody was in the Pentagon that day, and we needed a war plan. We were going to attack Grenada. If you all remember all that back during the Reagan years. And I remember Daniels telling me after we go to the Gulf War, we obviously won the war very decisively. And he said to me, we used a platinum hammer to beat a bug, is what was his comment. He was from the South, and I was from Texas, so he had a Texas drawl, and it was really kind of sounded better from him. But the point is we had developed all of this very exotic, stuff to beat the Soviets attacking us in NATO. And then Saddam Hussein was the beneficiary of all that investment. And of course, the big part of that is the Chinese. And so this was ultimately getting to the China-Taiwan thing. The Chinese went, whoa, what the heck was that? And you saw through the 90s a whole bunch of academic-y military papers about what the heck did we just see? And that led to the Chinese changing their entire investment strategy and gets us to today. I mean, just so you see, and so when I did Flashpoint Golan, I was well aware of this whole, this dynamic, and I basically just built it into that design so that sensing and shooting indirect fires was, in fact, and counter battery and all that stuff is what we've been talking about through the 80s and through the 90s. And so the game was just reflecting what I felt was already the emerging reality. It just hadn't been tested till much more recently.
So, if I may ask a follow-up question about Gulf Strike. I mean, I was an officer in training. I came out of the Bush, and we were told that the Iraqis had invaded Kuwait. Right away. I'd already played Gulf Strike 10 times before the invasion, so I just sort of laid it out. And again, we spoke before this this talk that at the Senate Armed Services Committee hearing, you had Edward Luttwak coming out and saying there's going to be 50,000 casualties, and then Trevor Dupuy came out and said no, it's going to be an order of magnitude less. Your simulation was in the minority in predicting accurately the actual losses. And we can pick up details from, Tom Clancy's got this one chapter where a platoon of American M1s is basically wiping out a division of T-55s. So there's obviously been a revolution in military affairs in a material sense that although an M1 tank is not invulnerable, it is to a T-55. And obviously, Larry Bond had helped Tom Clancy with some wargaming. What led you to the design? I mean, if I could be a bit conspiratorial, this year the war games at the Naval War College were released, and both Gulf Strike and Aegean Strike look very similar to the games that were being played that year. And I'm wondering, and I'd asked this to Frank Chadwick earlier about some sort of informal atmosphere that emerged in the Beltway that sort of influenced people in what war games they were designing. What philosophy in design did you follow when you made that very influential game? And I mean, frankly, it's the ultimate test that more than half a decade after you designed it, it played out accurately what occurred on the battlefield. So how did you design this game?
So this is an interesting one. So when I was in the game business, I had this fledgling company called Victory Games, and I had left the DoD world temporarily through the 80s to run this game company. And we got this game company, and unless you've been in publishing, the day you open a game company, you got no games. I mean, unless you brought them with you. So you design games, and designing games and then publishing them is 6 to 9 months if you're really hustling. We had a printing plant, but we were hustling, and so Victory Games started in the spring of 1982. Yeah, spring of 82 is the beginning of Victory Games, and the first 4 games came out February of 83. A year later, 9 months later. So I had this staff, and the most important thing in a business is cash flow. And I knew people in Washington, and I had done some work, and I'd already had a short but reasonably impactful career. And they asked me to design an operational level computer game, war game for them, which was called the Theater Analysis Module, the TAM, which was a follow-on to something I'd done earlier called the SAS, which was Strategic Analysis Simulation, meant to look at World War III. So I do this game, and I've also got this game company. So I go, So here I'm being paid to design a fairly detailed simulation, and I excuse me, that was an insect that's no longer with us. And so Gulf Strike was actually the first time and about the only time that I took a government game and I dumbed it down into a commercial game. So Gulf Strike started, but the scenarios were not. The TAM was a generic. Take any kind of ONC map, put it on the ground, throw some hexagons over it, and you can play it. But it had this 2-level thing going on and all this other stuff. And so Gulf Strike took that basic structure, and then I created the scenario. So the scenarios, it was really meant initially to be a Soviet invasion of Iran. Remember, this is going back a ways, to try to close off the Straits of Hormuz. And as it turns out, and I decided to. And then, of course, the Iran-Iraq war was going on at the time. So I kind of came up with this, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait scenario, which ultimately became the thing that got everybody's attention. So it was just kind of one of those things. In fact, I never, given that you guys you're Canadian, I came home from the Pentagon one night during Desert Shield. So this would be like in, late August of, whatever it is, 1990, right? Yeah, 1990. So the late summer of 1990, and there was literally a dozen film trucks outside my house. My daughter who's now having her second grandchild, was a little girl, and she was very excited about all this fuss. And I come into the house, and I literally, without even having dinner, I sit down, I give like 12 interviews in a row to various people all about Gulf Strike. And this Canadian crew, this is the one where the Canadians come in. This Canadian crew comes in, and they're up in my office, and they have there's a guy with a camera and this guy with a microphone, and he says, "So, Mr. Herman, why did you want to make money off the blood of dead Americans?" That was his opening question. So I say to the guy, well, I did the game, remember this is 1990. I said, I did the game back in 83. And he goes, stops the camera, goes through his notes, sees that I'm, that's correct. So then he literally says, damn, now I have to turn you from a very, very bad word to a seer. I'll leave out the word he used. And then he started the camera and it was like nothing happened. So I learned a lot about the press that day. So Gull Strike, the genesis, it had good bones, it had good genesis, and it reflected my view of modern combat. And modern combat, in many ways, between like in Iraq, when you have a very training and capabilities are very disparate, it's going to look a lot more like an ancient battle. One side's going to take, the Battle of Marathon, they lose, the Elgin Marbles, what is it, like there's 180 guys, 82 guys get killed, and the Persians lose like 5,000. So modern combat can come out like that. And that's what Gull Strike was. That was the reality of a Iraqi army going up against a US-led coalition. And it worked out that way. And as I told you the other night, Julian, it's noteworthy that the American unit with the highest casualties as a unit was a Pennsylvania National Guard water purification unit that was sitting in its barracks sleeping when a Scud missile hit. So most of the casualties that we took in the war came from this missile hitting a bunch of Pennsylvania young men and women, by the way, who were basically sleeping in the barracks far, far from the front. They were nowhere near the shooting, but the missile, the Patriot battery didn't shoot it down, or we're not even clear they shot any of them down. And the missile hit the barracks, and a lot of people got killed. So that's sort of the nature of Gull Strike and how it got, how it came to be.
It's also operationally, it captured, as an emergent property, it captured the offensive that came in from the left flank deep in the desert. I mean, just as a function of the buildup of the units and the stacking limitations and the frontage limitations. The very first time I ran it, I essentially, with your system, anticipated the actual battle as it was conducted. And I found that was a very powerful. I just out of curiosity, do you recall a book by Joshua Epstein? It would have been written probably, the reason I turned around looking on my bookshelf, I'm trying to pull the book down here, but he did a quantitative analysis, which occurred around the time that you wrote your book, and I'm not sure if you can see the title here.
Oh, but, yeah, I didn't reckon. I have seen that book, sure.
Okay, I just want.
I don't know when it was written. I definitely. I mean, look, like any historian, I'm influenced by everything I read, but I definitely read that book back in the day. But I don't know what's the date of publication date of it.
Well, no, that's 1984. But he did I think it was an 82 book where he ran. I believe it was Symphony, which is the Excel of its day. It was a symphony program at the back of the book where the Soviets drove through the mountains of Iran.
Oh, I definitely didn't look at any computer program on that. So, but
no,
I definitely remember that book. In fact, when I gave it away a long time ago, but I do remember the book.
Oh yeah, okay. So this is actually his second book. The reason I asked of my interest in your game was his book. He ran a very explicit Lanchester equation, so I was wondering if there was some interaction there. But it's been such a long time.
The Lanchester equation, we can go into that forever. One of the things that was very big in the Pentagon when I got there in the late 70s was something we called, it would be pronounced WEWA, but what it stood for was 2 3-letter acronyms. It was called a weighted effective indicator, weighted unit value. So the WE was WEI/WV, and what it would say was they would use a lot of what I call the mathematics of the Delphi technique, which is basically just eliciting opinion. And we've all taken opinion polls like that. They'll say, is A better than B and C is better than A? And you go through, so imagine that's tanks. So like, they would say, is an M1, is an M68-3 better than a T62, which is better than, and by taking all this opinion from a lot of officers, they developed a weighted effective indicator saying, an M60 is this much points and so on and so forth. And then they used that same opinion thing to create what they call a weighted unit value. And the only one I remember is like an automatic weapon, let's say like an AK-47 or an M16 would be a 1. a tank was 79 times better than an M16. Now, at some level, that sort of is absurd. Like an M16 is like 0 next to a tank, but let's just accept that it's some kind of strange mathematics. And then they would take the table of organization and equipment of a unit, and they'd add up all of the the things, and they would multiply them by their thing, and they'd sum it all up. And so a tank division would be like 3,228.798, whatever it was its value. Going back to my idea of convergent evolution, I use similar things when I rate things, and so I might say a tank division is a 10. Now, you could take the we-was scores and divide them down to get down to 2-digit numbers, and maybe a tank's 28 versus a mechanized division would be I don't know, 18, and you'd see how those numbers would come about. So the point of all that is that you come up with these values, and then you try to apply them in a wargaming setting, and that's just been going on forever. I mean, in whatever method you like. And so Lancaster's equations, going back to the original point, he's got the linear law and there's two laws.
The square law.
The square law. Thank you. I knew it was exponential. I just didn't think it was called that. So the linear and the square. Now, the linear rule covers like Rome. I have to walk up to stab you in the heart, kind of thing. And so we can look at length of lines, and it actually I've used it on occasion just to look at things, and it doesn't do a bad job for certain battles because the length of the battle line matters. And so if you've got more guys, the idea that you're flanking or whatever would matter. In fact, anytime you read ancient texts, one of the most important things they described was how deep was the phalanx, because that told you, did they have to give up mass to get width? Because the last thing you got to do is you don't want your lines being overlapped, otherwise you're going to lose. That they knew. So they would go from like 16 guys deep to 4 guys deep if they had to make sure that their line was just as long. But if you're 4 guys deep, the other guy smacks into you, he's going through the middle. So that's a trait, but that was an important consideration. So anytime you do a simulation, you have to sort of understand what were the critical factors of who won and who lost. But that's handled pretty well by the linear law. The square law, it was, this is what's his name? Lancaster was looking at air-to-air combat in World War I. So, but it doesn't do a bad job of like battleships, in 2 parallel lines exchanging shots. But again, it got overused. In other words, it was designed to show one thing, and then it became, the font of all knowledge, and that was where it got, it doesn't work that well.
Yeah, I mean, for Trevor Dupuis, he has a book out called Attrition.
QJMA. Trevor and I knew Trevor personally, and I will tell you that I like Trevor and I appreciate his service to the country. But pretty much every discussion between Trevor and I ended up with Trevor yelling at me. and he was a colonel in the army, and he was an angry guy when he wanted to be. I was a lot younger, and but he yelled at me.
He appeared. He appeared quite angry. He had a letter to the editor in International Security, and he definitely let people know what he thought about them.
Well, I remember there was that famous he and Mearsheimer tried to kill each other in in the press over Mearsheimer criticizing his big database that he was so fond of. And in fact, my newest column in C3I, I actually go through some of that, but they just. That was about the 3-to-1 ratio and all this kind of nonsense, but it was a lot of yelling and screaming. I wasn't used by it all because I wasn't for once I wasn't in Trevor's line of fire, so I was happy to watch the sparks fly. It was pretty fun.
No, very strong personalities. If I may ask another question, this is I think relatively controversial for sort of liberal-minded Americans, and I think all Americans are pretty liberal-minded, and that's the issue of assigning qualitative values to armies of different cultures. So there's Kenneth Pollock, who did his MIT dissertation on Arab culture and effectiveness. I think he went off to the CIA.
You mean his book Elusive Victory?
No, sorry, that was Trevor Dupuis' book.
There's another book called Arabs at War was another one.
Correct, but his dissertation was a lot better than his book. It was about 3 times as long, and Frankly, I thought his book was simplified. His dissertation is what I assigned to my students, even though it's an insane 900 pages or something. The analysis, I mean, his methodology is frankly really good. But journals like the Journal of Armed Forces and Society, which is sort of a sociological journal of combat, you know, in terms of performance and a whole bunch of other different variables, they're very critical. So in your Gulf Strike, you do have distinctions made for levels of training. So you have, you know, elite, line, and obviously, you know, the basic militia, which are, I guess, enthusiastic students. Frankly, a division of enthusiastic students is about as equivalent, though far more durable, as a battalion of highly trained specialists. But what's your approach or thinking? I mean, are there cultural differences? Are there not? If so, how do we measure them? Certainly, Kenneth Pollock thought there were differences. He didn't come up with qualitative differences, but you know, he looked at things like patrolling. Some cultures seem to accept the risk of patrolling. Others, and you know, frankly, the Canadian Army, to some extent, in the Kandahar portion of their Afghanistan deployment, preferred to stay in garrison and not wander around the hills at night. Is this a thing? I mean, my impression is that at least in DoD, there's a reluctance to go beyond the WEWAF calculations, and they really just want to count the numbers and do not touch the differences in culture.
So I'm going to call this the, you know, what's his name? Well, Jared Diamond wrote a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, which as a guy who has a degree in history and biology, I really think he actually got to the nut of it. I'll come back to that. And then there's the famous, oh God, you're getting old, but you know, he wrote all these books on culture and warfare, and you know, he's very famous. He's in California. You know, I used his stuff for my ancients work. He's great. His books.
Oh, right, yes, yeah, I forgot his name. Yeah.
Anyway, so the two ways this comes about is so Jared Diamond's take, who's an anthropologist, comes about saying that you know, he answers a simple question. You know, he was working with New Guinea, working out of New Guinea, you know, tribes and all that, and they call anything that they can't make cargo. That's this term that they use for anything. You know, a truck, a car, a plane. You know, some really cool device that's just cargo. And the question that this one guy wants to ask him is, how come the white guys have all the cargo? And so his whole book is a brilliant exposition about how we got here. But ultimately, it's about the advantages of technology and the organizations that you create around technology. Okay. It's right on the tip of my tongue. And the other one, which is this culture argument, says, you know, some people are just tougher than others. You know, that's that kind of thing. And I think that there's really little to no actual historical basis for that discussion. I mean, if you really get into it, it just doesn't hold up. The thing that I would tell you.
Sorry, is it Victor Hansen?
Of course, that's what.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Victor Hansen is like the proponent of that school, and he wrote, and I've seen huge, you know, arguments between the Victor Hansen crowd and the Jared Diamond crowd. You know, so the idea that it's a liberal thing, I just think is nonsense. I just say, show me the real historical evidence. Now, it's not. It is true that certain warrior cultures are better than other non-warrior cultures, but ultimately, it's training. In other words. If you saw the movie 300, the Spartans were a professional militia. They really weren't a professional army. They were really a security force that was very intent on keeping, you know, this population that outnumbered them by 10 to 1, the Messenians, under, you know, lock and key and working the land. You know, basically you know, the antebellum South kind of model. You know, plantation owners, and they had a security force to keep everybody in line, and they did horrible things to do that. But all that training and that purpose made them better than their contemporaries in hand-to-hand, you know, the combat of the day, because everybody else was a militia guy. You know, they were a farmer or a potter or a tanner, and they, you know, they had the family armor, and they would line up once in a while and do a battle. So, give you an example. The last time I looked at this, a average U.S. Air Force pilot flies about 30 to 45 hours a month. A North Korean pilot, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, flies 30 to 40 hours a year. Okay. I don't know much about, I mean, I've been in enough planes to know that if you're getting into a high performance jet aircraft 30 or 40 hours a year, you're pretty much a take off and land alive kind of guy. You're not doing anything really complicated. And so a US pilot against a, who's literally got, more than 10 times the hours on, and we're going to talk about practice, by the way, in this Taiwan thing, is just going to smoke that guy. I mean, it's just not going to be, it's not going to be anything. It's like, like beating up a child. There's now, that's not to say you should be fair about it. It's a bad general who gets his people into a fair fight, but sure, nothing's going to. So training level is huge, and an elite unit. And one of the big moments in the Ukraine situation was the elite Soviet paratroopers. The battle for the airport near Kyiv was a critical moment. It just so happened again, this is where luck of the draw. There happened to be one of the best units in the Ukrainian army was there, and so really good troops went up against really good troops, and the guys with the bigger tanks came out ahead on that one. And by the way, the Russians held the airport for a while. It had to be taken back a couple of times. So it was quite a battle for that. But that battle was really the thing that decided, I'm working on a game on it, decided how the first part of that war, the first 2 months came out on the drive for Kyiv, because they didn't get that airport right away. And they also didn't shoot Zelensky, they didn't get the assassin, you could just have a couple of things different and everything comes out and everybody goes, oh, well, that was what was always going to happen. So, war is kind of funny like that. You can't predict things. So training to me is really and what's important in the Pentagon is it's measurable. I mean, I can measure. I did a center of mathematical entropy-based warfare. So entropy, as per Shannon in the 1950s, can be measured. So, for instance, you have two ships doing stores transfer, and normally good water, very experienced crews, that could take, let's say, an hour, whatever they're doing. You make the seas high or you lower the training level of the people, it could take 6 hours. The entropy is the physical measure of time different to do the same task. And so my point is there's many things that are quite measurable, but culture, I got to be honest with you, you take any human, male or female, and you train them, they will be deadly. And you give them proper NCOs and the culture of, of a unit organization and all that. So this patrolling, not patrolling thing is a training problem, not a culture problem, in my mind.
So, I mean,
so I don't think that's very PC, but that's how I look at it.
So you anticipated, obviously, the issue, which is, what did you predict before the Russians attacked Ukraine about how long Ukraine would hold out?
I can get my wife in here. The only person who knows my opinion of this is my wife. She's down the hall. I told her, she said, what's going to happen? I said, Russia is not powerful enough or big enough to take over Ukraine. Just can't do it. It's not going to happen. It's too big a country. It's too much of a mouthful. If the Ukrainians fight, which I think they're going to fight, because they've been fighting for 8 years in the East already. The Crimea was lost when the Crimea. If the Russians had made the Crimea thing a bigger deal, then maybe they weren't ready for it. But after 8 years of knowing what they were going on, and the U.S. Army was, Green Berets are about training guys. We were training the Ukrainians, and they were holding their own in the East. And so the Russians were going up against a battle-hardened army at that point, not the one they fought 8 years before, but the one that they had now. So I said, there's no way that the Russians can win this thing. They can blow the country up with nuclear weapons or some crazy nonsense like that, but there's no way they can win this war. So that's what I said. And like I said, the only person who I can, and believe me, it's a wife, so she'll tell the truth. Trust me. If she could say that I was wrong, she'd love that. But no, she'll tell you right away. I said that all along.
No, I mean, I made the tragic mistake of putting down in ink that before the war started, that it would take 2 weeks to get to the Dnieper River for the Russians. So, and I'm burdened with this.
I'm a big picture kind of guy.
Yeah, but if you contrast the Russian and Ukrainians by objective measures, Ukraine is very corrupt.
So is Russia.
Yeah, so is Russia. So we have two corrupt regimes. The Russians, in theory, should have had a good training regime because Donetsk and Luhansk, nominally you have an ethnic minority Russian and Russophone population. So the Russian army would be fighting to liberate their common kin. So at least the institution would say, you know what, even if the government is corrupt, we're going to train ourselves to fight for these good values. Ukraine, on the other hand, I mean, why wouldn't they disintegrate? They've got a majority Russophone population in Odessa. So even if
wait. You see, so I would ask you to think back to the Russian Civil War, and the Ukraine has always had a, centered around, the Kyiv was always its own power center, and it was. Yeah, they were all spoke Russian, but there was a Ukrainian language and it was a dialect and they have a history. And if you would recall, Stalin managed to get out of FDR the concession that when the new UN was created, Ukraine was its own country. Remember that? So the Soviets said, oh, look how clever we'll be. We'll make Ukraine a country and we will have 2 votes in the UN. That's better than 1. And as it turns out, that little deal, there's an ethnic nationalism opinion there that goes back to before the Russian Revolution. They were never part of the Muscovy, and again, old school. I'm a historian, and I don't see it the way you say. The way you said it, I don't see it that way. The fact that they speak Russian is a lot of people speak English. Canadians speak English. You didn't want. As I once told my opening is that, Canada is the only country to defeat the United States twice, turn back 2 US invasions. So, and you guys speak English, and how come you didn't roll over for us? You didn't. So it's a nonsense. I don't like that argument. I think it's a very weak argument.
No, out of curiosity, in the US invasion of Canada at the whatever it was at the time, Upper and Lower Canada, the English did actually fold. It was the French Canadians that affected the defeat both times, ironically. If I could have one last question before we take our break. Where do you see the conflict in Ukraine, out of curiosity? In terms of we have the attrition, we have the new technology, we have a relative will. I know it's ridiculous. I mean, it's almost unfair.
This war has no end to it at this point in time. I just saw something today, and again, I haven't been able to validate it, but I think it's accurate. Currently, the Russians have lost 80% of their pre-war inventory of tanks. 80%. That's a lot of damn tanks. Now, I'm not saying they can make more, but you don't make that. I mean, the United States makes, I don't know what they make now, but before the war, we were making 30 to 45 Javelin missile units. So, and we've given the Ukrainians in the thousands of those. So we have given the Ukrainians now 5-6 years of our production has gone to Ukraine to blow up those tanks. Obviously, they've got contracts out to replenish that stuff. But if the US had to go to war right now, I guarantee you it would be short of javelins because they must be taking them out of ready stocks. And we'll talk a lot about logistics is a very big deal. And the only thing that's really giving the Russians any leverage is the Iranians are quite happy to sell them, loitering missiles and ballistic missiles. And like I said, I think my mic isn't working. How do you see? Oh, that's
yeah. That's
let me answer. Well, if anybody, Julian and Brianna, if you have any questions, I can see the chat window just popped up. So let me answer Tony's question if I could. Can I assume that Julian and Brianna can see the question?
Okay, can I read it out? Apologies.
Go ahead.
How do you see space and cyber domains affecting warfare, and can it be modeled within the war games at the operational levels effectively? This is actually a student of mine who's played a great many war games.
So Tony and everybody else, of course, I have been doing space and cyber warfare for 25 years. So the answer is yes. Now, how do you do it? So what's interesting, so space conflict is really interesting. You have to have it's useful to understand things like the Van Allen belt and orbits, and you have to understand cislunar and Lagrange points. So there is what I'm trying to say is that gravity and creates a topography in space that is really, it's not just space, it's gravity and orbital mechanics creates the topography of space. So it's just a different, you don't have hills, but you have gravity wells, and you have to understand how gravity wells work and how the Van Allen belt works and how solar flares work. But yeah, but basically it's the same thing. You got reconnaissance systems, you got, sensing systems, you got all sorts of different kind of capabilities, and how you disrupt or jam or knock those down. One of the big problems, you might recall that actually it's pretty recently, the Russians blew something up, right? And there's this big cloud of, garbage literally circling the planet. And we've been moving satellites out of the way of this stupidity for an ASAT test that the Chinese did not too long ago and what the Russians did. So, there is a little bit of a what goes up must come down. It takes about 7 years for something to if it's within the Earth's gravity well to like deorbit. It takes about 7 years unless you do something about it. And so now you see a lot of technology around. Basically, imagine robotic arm spacecraft to grab stuff and either put it in the right place or get rid of it. Send it off into some other orbit, get it out of here. But there's a lot of junk up there. You want to talk about a graveyard of nonsense, just look at what's going on in space. So yeah, that's easy. Now, cyberspace is a different interesting area. So the thing that I had a group of people who did cybersecurity for 15 years. One of the interesting things about cyber is it actually exists in real life. There is a place for everything that, right now we're talking, we're Zooming and recording and all this, and somewhere there's a rack somewhere sitting in a data center somewhere that's actually operating this thing, right? There's real software, and there is a physical place where cyber is. It doesn't come from God, and it doesn't come from space or the ether. There's a place. Now that place is connected to other places through various, lines and communication and all this kind of stuff. So there's a physical dimension to cyber that usually gets lost on people. Then there's what I call the software, shield defenses kind of dimension of it, and you can calculate all of that. I worked out of Cyber Command for at least a decade, and it's really well understood how one deals with it. The only thing is it tends to be very, very classified. So I'm not going to go too far into it, but I just tell you that there is very robust cyber capabilities and space warfare modeled within war games all the time. And that's what I've been doing a lot of for a nonprofit over the last few years. So yeah, definitely very can be modeled. And if I may, at this point, there's only 5 of us here. Yes, I taught at Columbia for years. So Julian, I'm going to ask you, could you ask a question? And I'm going to ask Brianna to ask a question. And there we go. Julian, on the same way, how do you see InfoWar affecting the battle space? So InfoWar, that's a great question. So InfoWar has a couple of dimensions to it. So one is perceptual, right? So right now, it's clear that, at least in the West, Ukraine is telling the right story, right? The oppressed people, refugees, horrible Russians, and all this. And I'm not saying any of that's incorrect, but that's the story, the narrative that's being told at that level. I think that the Russians have been very careful about the use of cyber, not because they can't do it pretty well. They do know how to do it. It's that the Ukrainians are just as good at it as they are. And I think the Russians are actually being deterred by the fact that if they unleash their cyber stuff on Ukraine, I think Ukraine will do it onto Russia. And Russia's got a bigger problem with controlling its bureaucracy and its people through those mechanisms that I think the Russians are more worried about the Ukrainians could do to them in cyberspace than what the Russians could do to the Ukrainians. So I believe that while you haven't seen a lot of cyber is that there's a standoff there. That's my view. Otherwise, why wouldn't they do it? Now, where the Russians are doing fine in the info wars, the Chinese are buying the story a little bit, and they're having no trouble believing it's the West that's whether I don't believe that the Chinese believe that we started the war like the Russians are saying, but they do understand that they think it's cool because they're looking at China, they're looking at Taiwan, and they plan on doing the same thing to Taiwan that Russia's doing to Ukraine, so they're good with it. And the Indians are just sitting there going, Modi's just sitting back and going, hey, wow, we're getting oil at a discount. Look at how much money we're saving on our national budget. So they're this is real politique here. So the info war only affects those who can be affected. The reason, and there'll be, by the way, I can't think of a situation where a country altruistically who was losing a war, winning a war, went into negotiations before they had established their position on the battlefield. The Russians can't negotiate from a position of weakness. They have no leverage, and so they're going to keep going. And the Ukrainians are winning at the moment. It's going to be a bad winter, by the way, but it looks like I think Kherson is going to fall before the winter. It's effectively contested at the moment. I think they're dealing with it. The Russian atrocities are, I was watching you can watch it on Netflix, The Road to Berlin. The Russian army is no different now than it was in 1945. It's a brutal instrument. The Russian armies have traditionally are a rape and pillage army. They are hard boys, don't get me wrong, and they like shooting artillery. And this army doesn't look much different than that army to me. And believe me, there's been a lot of rape, a lot of brutality. The best way to shut up a rape victim is to shoot her. So this is going on forever, and this is the Russian way of war. So anybody says like, "Oh, this is the brutal war," this is the way the Russians have always fought wars. And anybody who thinks otherwise just needs to go read a book, because this is what they've always done. So yeah. So going back to your point, Julian, I see that in the game I'm working on, the effect of the info war ultimately is how it lubricates the ability of the West to give munitions to the Ukrainians. That info war is what's keeping the flow of stuff going in. That story is what got Finland and Sweden to enter NATO. This thing has been geopolitically, within my living, I'm going to be 68 in a couple of days. In my 68 years, nobody has screwed up this badly geopolitically that I can remember.
So if I may have,
Brianna, you're the only one who hasn't asked a question yet. I'm sorry to call on you.
Yeah, no, I think there might be a moral hazard because this is being taped. Everyone's just going to see it at their convenience. It's one of the downsides of YouTube. If I may have one last question before we.
Well, anyway, Brianna, I'm looking for a question from you because.
Yeah, Brianna, please.
I'm going to feel good.
Oh, here we go. The Indo-PACOM SCS-AO is home to many more state and non-state actors with varying levels of capabilities and interests. How do you personally balance multiple actors with tenuous ties to each other, such as in relation to information sharing?
I will tell you that first of all, that's a very insightful question. There is no easy answer to that. So the end of the day, so if you go back to my graduate degree, which I'm sure these people have similar kind of degrees, you think about bandwagoning, and you think about pushing back. Basically the two basic. If you're a small actor, you're either playing on one person's side or the other, to get leverage. That's at the end of the day, somebody else's bad news is your good news in many cases. So you look at the situation with India. So India is at some level, they're not getting, I'm not aware again what's happening in class, but I have no idea. I gave my clearances, a decade ago. But what's happening under the surface, I don't know. But Modi is definitely trading with the Russians, some stuff, and he's giving them ruble. He's trading in rubles and holding their ruble up, and he's getting oil and God knows what else. However, India is a very fractious place. You got Kashmir, you got Pakistan, you've got various groups within India who are not Hindus, but the Sikhs are. You've got a whole multi-polyglot country there that he's trying to hold together. So you start getting into the Graham Allison, what level of, are you looking at the rational actor model, the RAM, which has been found to be very inaccurate. So if you look at India as India, you can get one view of the world. If you look at India as to, where you are is where you sit, kind of part of that, that model, you're going to find that, there's just various levels of people cooperating and not. I don't believe that anybody fully cooperates with anybody, but they cooperate on certain issues. And so you have to be going back to Brianna's question, you almost need what they call a stakeholder. So one technique that I have used, Brianna, is called a stakeholders matrix. So a stakeholders matrix says, okay, here's, A through Z, and here's issue A through Z, or A prime through Z prime, just to make it simpler. And you start to see where those intersections of who on any particular issue can find common cause with somebody else on that stack of people. And so you might find some very interesting connections between actors that you wouldn't see connected, but because of some weird connection on an issue, there is a dialogue. And most countries, even when they're at war with each other, have a dialogue of some kind. It's rare that there's no dialogue. So we have a dialogue going on with the Russians right now. They call us up to tell us something stupid, and we tell them don't do it. And but there's a dialogue going on. They're trying to say, how upset are the Americans and NATO going to be if we use a nuclear weapon? Is certainly the question that's on their mind right now. And so there's a lot of interaction and signaling and all this kind of nonsense about. And I guarantee at some point the Russians will get it wrong. So that I can predict. I was doing a talk for the Naval War College, and they said, in your new Ukraine game, you're going to use nuclear weapons. And I said, only if they get used, because I'm doing a first draft of history. I'm not doing a what if game. I'm doing a first draft of history game. The game will come out on the Battle of Kyiv about 2 years after that battle resolved, back in the beginning of this year. So those indicate. So I would offer, Brianna, that looking at a stakeholders matrix allows you to see the sort of the subtle relationship between all of these different interests and capabilities. And that's been the only way I've been able to visualize that level of complexity.
Oh, that's fantastic. So I'm going to, and we're back at the Wargame Design Speaker Series with Professor Herman. And in the second half, we're going to discuss issues surrounding China and Taiwan and some other issues. So we have a question from Julian here, and he asks, considering the fact that many revolutions have led to more bloodthirsty regimes, do you believe that if there was to be a regime change in Iran, the new regime would be any less authoritarian? So
I would start by quoting Peter Townsend from The Who, and from the song, who's the new boss, same as the old boss. So I don't think that as an American what'll happen. But I wrote a paper a number of years ago about how to change the Middle East ultimately, and it's kind of what's kind of going on in this country right now. And the answer is, half of all humanity is female, and at some point, the women of Iran, which has apparently already happened, have had enough, and that's half of them. As an ancient historian, Aristophanes wrote a play called Lysistrata, and the answer is the way they were going to stop the war is the women, the Athenian women, the Spartan women, were going to stop having conjugal relations with their husbands, and then the husbands at some point would just say, okay, the war's got to end. I think ultimately, although that was meant to be political satire, ultimately that's the path. I mean, the only way that what's going to happen in Iran is going to be better than what they have now is that the women have to finally say enough's enough. This misogynistic, male-run society just has to stop. And until the women stop it, it ain't going to stop, because the men are happy with the way it is. And that is really the way of the world. And right now in the United States, we're going to find out in about, a couple of days, how angry are half the women in the United States. I've already voted, to support, the women in my country. But if they won't vote for themselves, there's nothing I can do about it. So the end of the day, the women have to stand up and say enough's enough. And I'm with them 100%. And as far as what regime would be better or worse, it's still going to be an Iranian regime. It's still going to be an Iranian country. They may start having a more legitimate conversation between men and women in that country about how they dress and all that. But I don't know that it'll be particularly more Western. It'll just be Iran without stupidity. So we'll see what happens, but it can't be worse. Could it be worse? To your point, I guess, Julian, you're thinking about the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror. I suspect that what would happen is if the regime was overthrown, there will be what I call the witch hunts will begin for the worst offenders of the Revolutionary Guard who were beating up people and killing them and all that. I suspect that those guys need to get out of town because the crowd's going to find them, and so you're going to have a pretty brutal counter revolution, or counter move once if they gain power. Then what comes out of that, I don't know. But like I said, if the regime is overthrown, I wouldn't want to be one of the senior people from the old regime, at that point in time.
So we spoke about this on the break. If you could, humor us with a sort of the back of a napkin 5-minute rules for a revolution in Iran. What are the outlines of a design of a game of political revolution in Iran? How would you approach that?
So you typically have, there's three, let's just say there's three dimensions of leverage in this situation, right? There's economic, there's political, and there's, force, and culture, So as long as the regime has men with guns and batons who are going to stand with them under all conditions, the only way they can be overthrown is you have to model, the people have to turn the army against the government. Because if they've got a lot of brutal guys with guns, you need a lot of brutal guys with guns. And that's the way it is. And I'm sure that the Iranian government has been very careful, unlike America, where everybody has an AR-15 except for me. There aren't a lot of AR-15s running around that aren't in the hands of the military or the Revolutionary Guard. So ultimately, the army has to change sides. That's the only way this government's going to fall, because then there's enough guys with guns who can stop the guys with guns. And that's, if you're going to model it, you don't have to get too complicated. Now, can you use other forces to bring the army into the game, as it were, and flip sides? We're going to find out in Brazil right now. There's Bolsonaro. Where's the army going to be? Is the army going to support a Bolsonaro stay in power thing, or are they going to say no? Lula won the election, as bad as he is for Brazil, and he's the new president. Don't know where that's going to be, but ultimately, and if you look at what happened in the United States, Trump couldn't get the military to back him. So he could get a mob to attack the Capitol, but he couldn't get, and he was able to neutralize the Department of Defense for a while, like a few hours, until the Congress started calling him up and saying, "Get the hell over here." And there's a lot of jurisdictional issues, but they eventually, got people with guns into the Capitol to throw out the crazies. But it was an insurrection. But if the military, if Milley had decided that the U.S. Army was going to support Trump, what was I going to do about it? I'm going to like take out an M1 tank with my car. So it comes down to where the army is going to be in this thing. And the army may not be a big fan of the Revolutionary Guard. Just don't know how well they've done, sort of the commissar model. I just don't know enough about the current Iranian government to say in the army what's going on there. But if those guys flip, it can happen. But without them, it's just going to be a long, fractious, unstable period. But eventually, they'll kill enough people that they'll just, it'll come back up again. But you just can't, there's only so much until the soldiers flip sides, they'll just machine gun their people down.
What do you think of the hypothesis that Vladimir Putin recruiting such a large portion of the I guess the Russian male conscripts is breaking the social contract? And some in the West think, what, this is a good way to accelerate him out of power.
Oh yeah, I mean, look, the idea. Remember, you went back to the culture thing, right? Earlier about, so you take some kid and you give him a rusty AK-47 and 4 or 5 days of training how to shoot it, load it, and maybe even clean it. I mean, I don't know what they're even teaching them that. And you throw them into the front lines, they're just going to get killed. It's just a mob with weapons, but there's no sergeants, there's no cohesion, there's no battle drill. I mean, they're just going to get killed. That's just cannon fodder. And the more he does that, the more, I mean, I believe that more, he called up 300,000, I think that was the number. I think more young men fled Russia than he was able to get into the army. So wait till so after he runs out of these 300,000 are useless. You can't have a soldier with less than, I don't know, if you were lucky, we used to have what they used to call, in World War II, the U.S. Army was so short of second lieutenants, they call them 90-day wonders. So they took a guy who had just gotten through basic training, and they gave him 90 days of OCS, and then they threw him into Europe. And the casualty rate of second lieutenants in the United States Army exceeded the number of people who were second lieutenants in the US Army. That means they were getting wounded, not dying, getting patched up and sent back in again so they could get hit again. So, I mean, so that didn't work so well, but, you know, luckily we had good sergeants, you know, but that's, you know, we did those kind of things. So it doesn't work.
Do you see an army coup?
What?
Do you see an army coup in Moscow?
You know, they had one thing about Putin that I can see is his level of paranoia and, you know, the Stalin-esque kind of paranoia. I don't know how an opposition, the only way that Putin is thrown out of power is if the army throws him out again. We're having that same conversation because the FSB is those are his guys, you know, and his women, you know, I'm just saying guys in the generic, but his people are the ones running the FSB right now. And by the way, have you noticed that there's been a number of oligarchs that have sort of had weird accidents? So I suspect that whatever was the cause of their, you know, falling out of a hospital room, committing suicide out of a hospital room after they had already been hurt in some other kind of incident, or you know, Reichstag fire kind of Chechnya thing that he's famous for, or, you know, whatever other nonsense he's up to. Until the army turns on him, he's in power. I mean, it's just the end of the day. And remember, Russia does have 3x the population of Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are taking losses. I mean, it's, you know, the only thing, you know, as an American, and I don't know how Canadians think about it, but as an American, the only good thing coming out of Ukraine is Putin isn't getting into trouble anywhere else because he's so tied down in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians, God love them, are, you know, just bogged him down forever. He ain't doing nothing again, and his regime has got two directions. It's going to be in a war with Ukraine for the next X amount of years, or he's going to be dead. I don't know which one, and he'll, of course, we all die eventually. He's not that, he's actually my age, so he's only like late 60s. So I mean, he's probably got plenty of years, unless he's got some secret, we're talking about some secret disease, and I think it's just all fancy nonsense. I think he's fine, or he's fine long enough, and this is not going to go anywhere. He has no ability to end this unless we'll know he's ready to end it some other way when the TV guys start saying, you know, it'd be a good idea to end this. That he controls those organs of. Somebody was talking about the info war thing. Until Putin changes his info war message to his own people, this war's on. And I just don't think the army is going to turn on him just because they're not capable of it. You know, he'll see it coming and shoot a bunch of guys as they're happening. So that's his, you know, he's got that going for him to keep him in power.
Yeah, Barry Posen at MIT said that the Russians can't lose. With or without Putin, Russia can never lose because they'll simply retreat behind a barrier of nuclear weapons. So at some point, whether it's Putin or the army, they decide to end it, they'll walk out, or, you know, maybe they'll hold on to Crimea. But ultimately,
well, I think that's the thing. Even if the Russians did that, the Ukrainians don't have to stop. See, that ultimately Ukraine, if they hold their position, the Ukrainians are either going to give back their whole country, or they're not. You know, this is no. That's maybe there'll be some minor, you know, border change stuff, but that just creates revanchism, which comes back again. Also, what gets missed by a lot of people is most of the big oil and interesting resources that Ukraine holds is in the east. That's why Putin wanted it. He wanted now we can get into the Taiwan thing if you start talking about the geography of Ukraine. But anyway, did I answer your question? I think I did.
Yeah, definitely. No, let's get into the China-Taiwan thing, because I mean, there's the same question, which is, you know, what is your estimate of the character of the Chinese soldier that's going to land on a beach or enforce a blockade of Taiwan? You know, we have single child families in China. You have, I mean, I stayed for an extended period outside of Shanghai with some people I know very well, and nationalism in Shanghai is very different from Beijing. There's a nostalgia in the City Museum of Shanghai, which celebrates the period of 1870 to 1930, which is anathema to the communists. They have this sort of life-size museum of how wonderful it was when the Japanese and Western business people were in the city. So, so let's perhaps let's get into China, Taiwan, whichever way you'd like, in terms of how we approach modeling and understanding that possible conflict.
So I will start the conversation around things that I always look at first in this kind of, war, not a tactical thing, but a war. And that is geography and what is victory? Like what does winning look like if you're going to go play the, roll the thing on war. So, and I'll start with the geography first, because I think it's interesting so what we're very good at is taking lessons from one war and applying them to another situation, and it has very poor connection. So the last war that we're going to draw lessons from is Ukraine, because it's ongoing. And what that war is about is, it's basically, it's World War II. I mean, you got mechanized forces, you've got air forces, there's obviously some very big, but and artillery is, long range fires is definitely, back in vogue again. Not that it ever went out, by the way, but in this context, it's all about indirect fires. The big thing is how sensing is occurred. So in the past, you'd fly a plane over, a U-2, a satellite, take pictures, but now we have these small drones, and you have two kinds of drones. You have sensing drones, and you have what I'll call kamikaze drones. The US has a variant of that called, where we have a drone that's recoverable because it only shoots one missile, shoots a hellfire at somebody. I once joked that the way to improve the kill probability of a hellfire was to open up a Ford dealership in various countries so that we can give them bigger cars. So you get more terrorists in the car, the missile can kill more guys per shot. So that was, and obviously I have a very sick and perverse sense of humor in this regard, but it is mathematically true. So whether you like it or not. But the drones are just, what's interesting about the drones is that a country that doesn't really have an air force, although they do have an air force, but they're not able to control their skies, is still able to get long range sensing done with these little drones because they're small. I mean, they don't make a lot of noise. They're very small. They're almost ubiquitous, and hitting one, even if you saw it, shooting it down is just not that simple. I mean, unless you're Davy Crockett or somebody, shooting at a couple hundred yards, a drone is this big, at a couple hundred yards, it's going to be like a dot. And the ability to knock it down isn't going to be real good. You're not going to hit it with a bullet. You're going to have to use like a burst of some kind to, knock it out. So very hard to knock them out. The kamikaze drones were a pain, So what's interesting is, this goes back to World War II, and why do we call them kamikaze drones? Because they're kamikazes. And what the Japanese, one of the interesting things about doing I've done multiple games of the Pacific War, is that the Japanese initially had these incredibly trained pilots, Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea and all this jazz, and these guys were, ridiculously good because they had a lot of flying time. Read Saburo Sakai's, autobiography, I should say, and you really see it's called Samurai, which really gives you an insight into that culture. But once those guys, that initial group of elite knights, pilots, whatever you want to call them, were killed mostly at Midway and just through long range attrition across the war because they didn't have a good replacement system, is at the end of the day, they could take you or me or Tony or Julian or Brianna, and they can put us into a situation where in about 10 hours, they could teach us to get a plane off the ground, sort of fly it, follow somebody, which would be the pilot that's going to come home, tell us what a carrier looks like, and then have us dive into it and kill ourselves. And so basically you had created a smart missile in World War II based on the fact that the smart part was the human operating the craft. Then the Soviets in the late 40s and 50s, developed a series of large cruise missiles. And what they were trying to do was create kamikazes without people sitting in them, because even the Soviets weren't, nobody's going to sign up to that stupidity. There's the one thing that's always been said about the Japanese are like everybody else, just more so. And I think that there's a cultural dimension, that how they see the world. And I think it's going to become important for the Chinese, by the way. So we're going to come back to that piece of it. They have a different culture as far as what they're willing to individually do or how they interact with each other in groups. And it's just, that's very cultural. It's nothing to do with how effective they are or not effective they are in warfare. It's just that they have a different way of interacting with each other. But at the end of the day, I taught at Columbia, you went to Columbia, and I had, out of 106 students my last year I taught there, easily 60% of them were Chinese from China. They were Chinese. And what I learned was that a Chinese kid from China, because they used to come, to my office hours, is they all had committed parents who cared about them, spent a lot of energy, getting them trained up and making them good people. And at the end of the day, they're just like any other kid I've ever ran into with nice parents. I remember one time some young lady was showing me her resume, and she wanted to do something with medical stuff. And her whole background was in math and IT. And she said, here's my resume. What do you think? Will I be able to get a job in medicine? I said, this resume tells me nothing. You have no chance of getting a job in medicine with this resume, but it's a great resume. And she said, well, and she started arguing with me, well, I don't agree. And I said, well, then I finally said, what did your father say? He said, well, he said what you said. It's like, so the answer is dads are dads and kids are kids, just how it is. So at that level, I don't see any real difference between, Americans or Chinese or anybody else. But when it comes to how the political power can mobilize a society, there is a different set of connections and culture, and that's different. And it would be weird, they're never going to be a democracy, and we're never going to be a totalitarian society. Somebody may try to take over this country and make us a fascist country, but at the end of the day, way more than half of us aren't going to go for it, and that'll be sort of, it won't last long. If it starts, it's going to stop pretty fast. At least that's my view. We just have a culture of not listening to that crap, and so, that'll sort itself out on its own. So going back to the geography, so Ukraine is.
Sorry, may I ask a question on this before we go to geography?
Sure.
Obviously, there's a great failure to anticipate the quality of Japanese planning. Just sort of orthodox maneuvering on the battlefield that led to them defeating both the British in Singapore and the Americans in the Philippines when they were outnumbered. Draw it up to sort of Western cultural arrogance. Are we not anticipating a cultural change in China that would make them fight and much harder than we think they are? Or
no, so this goes back to that earlier we talked about Trevor Dupuy and the Mearsheimer argument. And Mearsheimer focused on the Malaya campaign of 1941 and how Trevor's case study on it was all botched up. You can go look at it, it's all in the academic paper. It was in international studies, I think it was a whole bunch of yelling and screaming. It was great stuff. But the point is that the Japanese had taken a couple of divisions. There was the 5th Division, which was the best division pretty much in their inventory. They had the Imperial Guards Division, which was actually pretty good, very and fanatically so. They had the 18th. So these were some of the best units that they had blooded in China over decades. So these were, well-organized units. And 5th was their only, was the best trained amphibious division in the Japanese army. So when you get down to this big picture stuff, you got to get down to the details of who are these guys attacking Malaya. And these are some of the best troops and then you had this guy named Yamashita, who was like their best, like Stonewall Jackson. I don't know a famous Canadian general, so I apologize, but Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant kind of guy, best they had, Subutai, the great field marshal from Genghis Khan's days. So you have this great general, you have a corps, an army, it was the 25th Army, one of the best trained armies in the Japanese army, and they go up against basically cops. Remember the Indian forces and the British forces in Malaya, primary job was keeping the Malayans under control. They're cops, they're police force, and they were the least equipped force within the British Army because the war in Europe was getting all the stuff, and Churchill, really didn't give a damn about Malaya, and given what was going on in North Africa and going on in and on the English Channel and all that stuff, it was just very badly resourced. So they had a lot of soldiers, but they were police officers with rifles, and they didn't have good training. So you had lousy trained units whose real function in the world was to just beat up on civilians when they had to, and then you come up with it's like a high school football team, and you got the Green Bay Packers coming down the road who are just going to roll them over. And on top of that, they had this guy named Colonel Suji, who was a war criminal who eventually hid long enough until the war crime trials were over, and then became a member of the parliament in Japan after the war, who had led a special unit studying all the problems of Malaya, and he had walked around in the place, and they had developed special jungle doctrine for Malaya. I mean, so they had this well-rehearsed, well-understood force, and the fact that they were outnumbered, 1-2, was meaningless because it just doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it was the training, it was the cohesion of the units, it was the fact that they were combat veterans units, elite units versus like a bunch of, local militia. And the Indian troops were very poorly led. And in fact, after the Japanese rolled over them, they had a ton of Indian units, in the POW camps. And this guy named Subrat Chandra Bose, who was an Indian, revolutionary who created the Indian National Army. He would recruit amongst the POWs, and a fair percentage of them decided that I could either be beheaded and beat up to death by the Japanese, or I could join this army and overthrow the British, who I don't really like anyway. So that's what was going on there. So a lot of, and of course, the white officers were, those are the guys who built, the River Kwai Railroad, they were beheading them, and the Australians and those guys didn't do very well. So the point of the story is experience. I mean, it's just a matter of experience. Now, if you look at Taiwan, the Taiwanese army hasn't fought anybody ever, since they were thrown off the mainland by Mao. We've been selling them, some really glitzy F-16s and tanks and stuff like that. I think we've equipped them exactly the wrong way. And there's been a lot of articles about how they're asking for the wrong stuff and we're selling them what we want, because we're making money. So they're badly equipped, I believe. They're not going to win a naval battle against the PRC Navy, PLA Army. It's funny that the Army is called the PLA Navy. It's People's Liberation Army Navy. So, again, going back to the tradition of the PRC, their Navy is much better than it was. And more importantly, after the Pelosi visit, which I think was just an excuse, they had been practicing their war plans continuously for the last 5 or 6 months. So the one thing that is getting dangerous is they're starting to figure out through training, they're bringing up the training level of their guys, and they're getting them used to the waters and what the war plan is and all this. And so the Chinese, although they haven't been in a war in a long time, they're being trained just like the Japanese were in Malaya. They're getting trained up to do this thing, this invasion. And I'm not sure how good and I don't know how seriously the Taiwanese are taking it. And so but what the Chinese do need to worry about is us and the Japanese. And the Japanese Navy is a no-kidding Navy, real blue water Navy, and so, of course, as is the United States Navy. However, the Chinese are not stupid. They know exactly what they're going up against, and they've been practicing how to deal with that. They've been developing certain weapon systems. How well all that stuff's going to work is hard to say, but here's the factor that is going to limit U.S. ability to intervene: logistics. For the first clashes of the war, my expectation is the U.S. Navy is going to launch a lot of hurt on the Chinese if we ever got into a fracas with them. However, the magazines of those ships is not, endless, and these VLS tubes have to be reloaded. And, once a submarine starts firing torpedoes into things, it's got to stop firing, or it's going to run out. It runs out of torpedoes, and it's got to hide because the Chinese, the Chinese going to be happy to lose a couple of frigates to a submarine. Then they'll know where the submarine is, and they'll start looking for it. So it gets really ugly. So I could see the first clash going to the U.S. easily, but then after that, it's an away game. And and Guam isn't moving, right? The Chinese know exactly where Guam is, and they know where everything is, and they know where they know where Okinawa is, and they know where our bases are, and they're all wired into that stuff. And so none of those bases are going to be operational very long once the shooting starts, and the Chinese feel that they can shoot at U.S. territory. And so, now the question is, can the Chinese actually get a sufficient force across the strait, which is about 160 miles, something like that, right?
80 at its shortest.
180, thank you.
No,
So
sorry,
at the
80.
180.
Just 80 in the north.
It's 80 in the north.
Yeah. Remarkably close.
Yeah, but 80 miles is a long way to go when people are shooting at you. But anyway, and the Chinese don't have unlimited, amphibious lift. They don't have a million, So can they get paratroopers and, special forces guys, fifth column guys to grab an air base? And, it goes back to like the key, those first hours, how hard do the Taiwanese want to fight? I don't know. How successful the initial little special tricks that the Chinese are going to pull on the Taiwanese going to work? Don't know. But it's a tough situation. And now that the China Xi has seen how rough a time Putin is having, he's got to sort of go, how good are my guys going to be? Remember, by the way, the Russians trained for an entire year for this invasion before they did it, right? The guys that came out of Belarus were training. I mean, I watched it on TV. They were training up there with the Belarusian army and all this kind of jazz. So, and Xi has also seen how quickly the U.S. was able to mobilize NATO against Putin. And in fact, now NATO's stronger than it's ever been in the last, 20 years. So will the U.S. all of a sudden be able to drag Australia? I think India is going to be a disappointment no matter what happens. But Australia, Japan, even the Philippines, remember the South China Sea thing. I have a map of it, I can show, but the U.S. under Obama really screwed up the whole South China Sea thing. And again, there's a lot of countries around that littoral who are not happy with what's happened in the South China Sea. And so they're not going to be all of a sudden, oh, we love China. And so we're going to find allies, active ones and passive ones initially. And if we can, if Taiwan can hold through, if Taiwan doesn't fold fast, now we're looking at a long, nasty war again. And now what's Xi going to do? While they're having zero COVID tolerance and, and all that, and then the supply chain is going to be shut down. So where's the money coming from? And, all those, now we're going to have a lot of trouble because all those we're starting to say, hey, we got to start making chips again. We got to start making PPP again. We got to start making stuff again because, China's not our friend, and that's going to be, and so that, how long that goes, the longer that goes, the better the U.S. will be in dealing with it. But new supply chains get made, overnight. We're already, in fact, all the big companies are already shifting into India and other countries because we recognize that, and they're doing it not because of a war, they're doing it because of, how China's handling the COVID, but, it'll have the same effect. So you've got to look at that. So if I were to sit back and look, what is Taiwan's victory condition? Taiwan's victory condition is that they can keep this, yelling and screaming, but no shooting going for the next 30 years. That would be good because Xi's not, remember, Xi is 67, he's my age. So he ain't going to live forever. And the next Chinese guy coming into power is probably going to say, and Xi, by the way, if I read all his statements, I saw the analysis, what he's more or less saying is, we're going back to the state-run economy. That is not going to help their GDP. It's just like trickle-down economics. It doesn't work. So this is a no-win. So Xi is taking them literally from a, we're going to become the biggest economy in the world and tell the U.S. where to go as an economic power, and they're going to burn it all to the ground over the next 10 years while Xi, gains total control again. Because no state-run economy has ever been successful against capitalism. This has never happened. It's not going to happen this time. And so his amount of resources is going to diminish over time. And as he loses economic power, his road and belt initiative and his ability to just pour money all over the world. He's right now having a real estate crisis because all their price. So the biggest problem she's going to start to have at some point is internal control. And we are going to focus on creating unrest. So I don't know. I mean, so I look at the political side of this thing is, as long as there's no war, we're winning. He's going to do all stupid things that are going to help us. Now, once he decides to pull the trigger, then all bets are off. And even if he gets Taiwan, it's going to be worth zilch. It'll be blown to pieces, just like it's going to cost, I don't even know, $5 trillion to fix Ukraine. Forget about the loss of life and that, I once told NPR, I was on an NPR interview during the Gulf War, and they said, it was about the 30,000 casualties. And the woman asked me, very nice lady, she says to me, so what do you think about how many people are going to get killed in this war? So-and-so said 30,000. I said, let me explain to you. The casualties are going to range between too many and way too many, and too many is one. So that's how I look at casualties. Talking about human life that way is just absurd. It's going to be a freaking economic humanitarian disaster if Taiwan is attacked. And it's going to affect the entire global economy. It's going to affect everything. So it is going to be a disaster of the first order, just like Ukraine is turning out to be. Big wars from expansionist powers. And get another thing, World War II didn't start out as World War II. World War II started out as a bunch of little local wars that sort of just kept getting bigger and bigger and expanding, and they connected, right? So you had Manchuria in 31, and you had in 36 the Chinese, the Japanese invaded Johor, and the Marco Polo Bridge incident and all that stuff, and then of course the rape of Nanking and all that. That was in the mid to late 30s. Hitler comes to power in 34-ish, and the push was in 24. By 33, he's in, I think he's the chancellor by 33. And then there's the Anschluss and so on, and then all of a sudden the deal with the Russians, and then the shooting really begins in Poland. But they'd already rolled over a couple of countries. The Western Allies didn't handle it well, and so now you got that going. And then when the Japanese attacked, Pearl Harbor, then Hitler did us the biggest gift in the world. He declared war on us on the 11th. So this bunch of these little wars just kept, and then they connected. So you could see, the thing I start to think about is, would you ever see a Ukrainian war that's still somehow going on connect up with China and the Taiwan war going on? And what about the DPRK? I mean, how many missiles did they shoot over the last week? I lost track. 30 of them? I don't know. And one of them was an ICBM. So that maniac is still on the loose. And he'll certainly go rolling in on China's side, believe me. So, things could get really, you could see a global conflict out of these regional stupidities of these expansionist powers. That's how it happened last time, and I don't see any reason why it might not follow that script. So the best thing we could do is we're going to have to step up to them now, because once you wait too, I think we've already waited too long. Actually, I think Obama screwed up with China and with the Crimea. I think that the Obama, look. I think President Obama was probably the most decent man that ever sat in the White House since Washington. So, as a person, as an intellect, as a person, he's phenomenal. But his foreign policy was a disaster for the United States. Crimea, if you just look at Crimea in the South China Sea, there's enough right there. And people talk about Libya, that was the least of his problems. It was those two that really were disasters in my mind. And Syria, he was just terrible at foreign policy.
Sorry, Professor Herman. Sorry, could I just a very short segue? You've designed a great many simulations that include these dysfunctional characters you're describing: Putin, Xi, Hitler. What is your theory? Because you must have assumptions. What is your theory for the recurrence of these bad leaders? What explains why that? You mentioned Xi is going back to a command economy. Given your experience, your unique experience having to simulate these individuals, why would he do this? And is there a general theory about where these bad leaders keep coming from, and why they do the things they do, and why they just keep repeating, what seems like some sort of pathology.
So there is a interesting book called Rubicon by a guy named Holland, which talks about the end of the Roman Republic. And to précis that book, at least look, there's a lot going on in that book, but to précis one thread of that book is that people in that period and subsequently every so often start to admire the guy who makes the trains run on time. The Mussolini, the strong man who lets them channel. So Hitler came in through a depression when there was a lot of anger over, there was a lot of angst over economic issues. And so ultimately there's always going to be something that galvanizes a group of people to say, this whole election thing, at least in a democracy, isn't working for me. And I'm not getting what I want out of it. And I keep losing because I'm in a minority opinion. So I'd rather than just overthrow the government, be part of that, now be the minority that's in charge. I think that's ultimately, part of the genesis. But every one of these cases it's unique. I don't like broad brush as a historian. I don't believe, although I believe that there's some elements of all this. And there's a lot of people who've written books about how authoritarianism, takes over and all this thing. So there's plenty of, there's plenty of data on how this all goes around. But if you're looking at a Taiwan situation, you have to look at the geography and the politics. And once the politics fails, which is really what it is, we're into the military side, and there's no room for negotiation unless Taiwan surrenders. Unless Taiwan surrenders, unless Ukraine surrenders, there's no end to it because the guy with the bigger resources isn't winning, and the total war, you go from limited war to total war very quickly. And once just read Clausewitz, once you cross that line, I tried to beat the crap out of you in a gentle way, but now we're gonna have to get serious, and it always gets serious. And so total war is I'm gonna burn this place to the ground until I get what I want. And China's got a lot of resources. So ultimately, the only way Taiwan holds on is if the West brings its resources to bear. Now you get into an ugly, a lot of nuclear weapons running around. One nuclear blast over a city will create more casualties than in the entire history of the United States, and the effects of that would be generational. So we're getting the fact that these folks are getting back up on their hind horse is not a good thing. And I'm not saying that we're going to have a thermonuclear war, but this is what it starts to, if you sit back to 1931, this is how it kind of looks, if you kind of roll it forward. Again, I'm a historian who does war games. I will tell you that, but the big thing is going to be it's the big thing in Ukraine. It's the big thing. Logistics is not being looked at enough in war games of this type. I mean, you really need to understand. I remember during the Gulf War, after about 3 days of desert, the shock and awe part of it, where we were shooting all our best T-LAMs and cruise missiles all over the place, that we had to slow it down because we didn't have an unlimited number of that stuff. We had actually burned through almost half of our inventory in like 3 days. So all of a sudden it was like, okay, what are we? But now of course we had blown the crap out of everything you wanted to hit. So that's when we started using the 500-pound bombs with the GPS kits. And I actually had you talk about technology. So one of my biggest contributions to the Gulf War was my crew did an analysis. So you've got GPS, right? So we all know, everybody's got an iPhone and you know where you are and all this based on the satellites. And then there's jamming, right? So the Iraqis had extensive jamming capability at all their key cities and bases and all this. But as it turns out that the better these bombs and these missiles have inertial guidance systems, INS it's called. That's what planes use until GPS, and all planes have a backup INS. And INS, by the way, is very accurate. It's very accurate stuff. And as it turns out, if you launch a missile at a place with jamming, the jamming only works a couple of miles away. So the GPS gets knocked out when the bomb is like, I don't know, 5 miles away. You know what the INS error for a bomb using INS of the backup system is for 5 miles?
No, what is it?
About 8 inches, 9 inches. So a 9-inch variance or a 1-foot variance, called 1 foot, a 1-foot variance on error for a 500-pound bomb is like, okay, who cares? And then what we did was we improved the performance by hooking. What hadn't happened was the GPS was independent of the INS. We had the GPS reinitializing the INS the whole way until it got jammed, until the jamming took place. So whereas before, when it left the carrier over, 120 miles, the INS could be off by, 100 yards, let's say. But once you, but over 5 miles, it's nothing. So once the GPS is talking to the INS, and so none of the Iraqi jamming worked because of that work. It was a cheap fix. And when we got to that war, none of that stuff worked. And they couldn't figure out why. And that's the answer is INS, a 1-foot error on a 500-pound bomb, who cares? It's so technology does matter at some level. But logistics is a big deal. And by the way, you cannot, this has been complained about, it is very hard to reload a VLS tube at sea. I mean, you can do it at a dock, but doing it at sea with, the boat's doing this, you got a long thing going into a hole, and if there's a little bit of bend, it's going to break it. So it's really hard to do. So, if the Chinese do stuff in like rougher weather, or there's like a little bit of bad weather, we're going to have to reload pretty far back. We're going to have to go back to Guam, but if Guam's being bombarded, we have to go back even further. And so reloading that stuff, or we go to Darwin, which, is Australia. That's where we're building a base in Darwin. So we could pull the ships back to Darwin and reload them there. But, there's a distance going on there.
So may I ask, in the next war, which I think was 1979, a simulation that you did with Jim Dunnigan, you had actual units of electronic warfare. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot being said about the huge Chinese investment in electronic warfare, and the Taiwanese creating maneuverable radar units so they could, avoid being struck and, drive down to the next hill crest to turn it back on. I have seen a YouTube video of a Ukrainian drone malfunctioning because of intense Russian electronic warfare. How do you assess? I mean, is it possible that the next war game exaggerated Russian electronic warfare in 1979, or what's happened? Do you think to the strength of that technique?
So, first off, 79 to now in technology is like dinosaurs to mammals. So there's not and the problem with brute force jamming is that you're emitting, and if you're emitting, okay, how long do you think thing's going to stay on? I can shut you down. I can always suppress you when I want to. If you see a HARM missile coming at your unit, and remember the transmitter antenna should not be next to where you're sitting, right? That's basic. You won't be stupid. I will tell you a funny story. During the early Pioneer, which is a drone program, I never forgot this. It was a video I saw in the Pentagon. It's really hysterical. So they had this early Pioneer, which was a drone that was flown off a battleship to do spotting for guns. Just a float plane without a pilot. And somebody said, okay, what happens if we lose connection with the plane? They said, oh, just have it fly back to a location. And so they gave the coordinate of the hut that they were sitting in. And there's this great thing where they lost control of the Pioneer. Remember, the thing is sending back video pictures the whole time. And so you see the video, the Pioneer is coming back to this, like it looks like a mobile home, and it's getting closer and closer. And all of a sudden, the doors of the thing open, and all the guys were running. And you realize that the plane is about to crash into where they're sitting, because that's where they told them to come back to when they lost control of it. So after that, everybody figured out we should probably put like a 300-foot offset to where we're sitting. But that's how you discover these very, complicated things. It was just, but I knew that video cracked me up. Thank God, nobody was killed, but they did lose a command van when the Pioneers slammed into it. So again, you can turn on transmitters all you want. It's just everybody in the world can see it. And remember, there's this thing called, the 1/r² rule. So that signal is going to go a very long way. And because of 1/r², your ability the radar detecting something is basically half the distance of what you're going to see the radar at. I'll see your radar 2 times away from where you are. So, okay, that game is well understood. I'm not that impressed.
So you don't see the fear that China's going to shut down the airwaves around Taiwan is exaggerated.
No, wait, that's not true. I can see them jamming the crap out of the place and shutting it down. But the question is, we'll know where those locations are. And they're actually, most of those transmitter sites, I actually have, it was in IISS, by the way, about 5 years ago. There's a whole map of where all that stuff is. Now, I'm not saying they don't have mobile ones and all that jazz, but the biggest problem is passive stuff. So I can triangulate and find out exactly where you're transmitting from. And if the Taiwanese have a missile that can shoot at it, they're going to hit it.
Yeah, I have a tutorial that's working on a very simplified simulation of an invasion of Taiwan, and it occurred to us that the more important battlefield is not the Chinese landing in Taiwan; it's actually the Chinese coast and all the railheads and all the ports, and that's probably where the battle is going to be fought. So we should probably focus less on beaches in Taiwan and ports in Taiwan, like Kaohsiung.
So you just said that the strait is 80 miles. Let's just say on average
in the north, yeah.
Yeah, but let's just say on average the strait is like 100 miles. Just make it simple, right? There is a boatload of systems that shoot more than 100 miles. So sure, you look at what the Ukrainians are doing to the Soviet depots over the border from in the east. They're hitting them all the time. So the Chinese, you think that the Taiwanese are not going to, once you start shooting at Taiwan, you don't think they're going to shoot back at those locations. So Chinese logistics, it depends on their ability to suppress that fire on their ports and on their railheads. But those things don't move. The Taiwanese know exactly, we know where they are right now. So so this I said it's about logistics. Even if I get guys ashore, how do I keep them alive there against a hostile population? And by the way, Taiwan's pretty, what's interesting is if you go back and look at the US war plans to invade Formosa, which the Navy mostly was supporting, King was very big on that. They realized that, it wasn't going to be it wasn't going to be like Tarawa, right? A 1 mile island. It was going to be, it's a mountainous place. It's got very few usable beaches. It doesn't have a lot of ports, and even if the Chinese grab the ports, I don't know that would they be able to hold them or even use them. And if the U.S. is using interdicting fires on those things, they're going to have a hell of a time. Mines, by the way, would be incredibly effective in this situation. I can just lace the crap out of the straits with mines, and see if Taiwan was smart and we were smart, we give Taiwan the ability to lay the world's biggest minefield in the straits, and we would give them lots of missiles and things that are very easy to fire. Don't take a lot of training. A lot of MLRS kind of systems, and the Chinese will have a hell of a time getting in there.
So there's a debate raging in War on the Rocks. And it's
I know the magazine.
Yeah. So they're obviously they're very concerned about whether landing is going to be easy or hard, and the two sides are still. So it seems to me you're taking the Ian Easton argument. He published a book I think 2 years ago on what an invasion of Taiwan would look like. On the other, and they're using models like the invasion of Sicily. On the other, studies of Anzio, people getting stuck on a beach or Salerno. On the other hand, there are those that argue that China is effectively militarized its entire civilian fleet. It's got 2,000 merchants. Now, of course, a tiny percentage of those are going to be able to land items on a beach. But if you look at the Germans working their way into Norway on a much, much smaller scale, you only need about 10% of those vehicles to be able to land people on the beach, and the rest can just, suffer a 20% attrition going for the ports and putting people into a half-captured port. So it sounds like
wait, there's one big difference. So let me. I'm not saying that's wrong because I don't have a crystal ball, but the difference between Anzio, Salerno, Sicily, and the Germans into Norway and into Norway is that the Germans sacrificed their navy to get there, but once they were there, the British didn't have a way to, they almost lost Narvik, but the British didn't have a way to counter invade, get them out of there. It was a mountainous place. So once the Germans were in, they were like a tick on the side of a dog. They couldn't get it out, but there was no more German navy, and they did have the ability to get from Denmark across the straits into Oslo, and then so they had a supply line that was very hard to break. The Allies had total naval superiority in the Mediterranean when we went into Italy. So even though we were stuck on the beach, we could get them out of there if we had to technically, and more importantly, they weren't running out of bullets and food. We could get that stuff into them because we had the port. We captured Naples early on. That was the whole point of Salerno, was to grab Naples, and then Anzio, was a little bit rougher. So the question is not that they can. I don't even whether they get ashore or not is going to be based on a bunch of weird variables that I can't. Again, I go back to the Battle of Kiev. How will the best Taiwanese military unit be sitting in the right place at the right time, or the worst one? And just don't know those factors. But if they get ashore, unless they can maintain real control over the straits, they're going to have a hell of a time staying on an island that they can't supply. That's all I'm saying. And so it's going to come down to air and naval superiority. Now, the advantage that the Chinese have is that they've got a huge missile force well within range of Taiwan that we will have a hell of a time getting through. That's possibly true. And it's close enough to China, they may be able to pull it off. If they get ashore, they may be able to pull it off. They may be able to suppress us enough that they can, but we can make them miserable. And more importantly, whatever they capture is going to be useless because it's all going to get blown to pieces. There'll be no it'll be a Pyrrhic victory at best. If we lose Taiwan, but its economic value is destroyed, which will happen. And the Chinese made a huge political mistake with Hong Kong. They're still saying, one country, two systems, but the Taiwanese saw Hong Kong. They're not stupid, So the only way Taiwan rejoins China is over some long, peaceful period, or it's going to be a violent thing that's just going to be a disaster. And I just don't know, how that's all going to go. But again, Taiwan is different than Ukraine. It's a much smaller place. It's isolatable. You can't isolate Ukraine from Europe. And that's the big difference. There's a supply line into Ukraine that comes right across the Polish and Romanian border. Can't stop it. It's trains. Taiwan's an island, so once you get the island, it'll be a problem. And
if I could explore further a conjecture you made, of course, Gulf Strike again was for me the model. The war in 1990 to recapture Kuwait started with a very long U.S. air campaign, which not many people, at least that I read, anticipated.
Was it 91?
Yeah, 91. Sorry, yeah, 91. Yeah. I think it was March. So I think the thinking was that the U.S. would have to go all in with air and land simultaneously, and ultimately that didn't happen. You conjectured that the Taiwan conflict would be the U.S. Navy showing up, inflicting hideous damage, and then there's a slowdown because of the difficulty, just the sheer distances the U.S. has to travel to re-equip themselves. I'm wondering if that isn't sort of similar to the U.S. Navy saving the U.S. garrison in Philippines model, where it's far more likely the U.S. Navy is going to go, we're not going to go in because it's too dangerous.
Well, the Chinese have made it so that, it's hard to say, but at some point, do the Chinese either horrendously damage or sink an aircraft carrier? That'll be a big deal. The Chinese also, unlike the Japanese, are going to put nuclear submarines on our supply lines into the area. Why wouldn't they? Now that means we have to go, and we have the U.S. Navy has traditionally was always gone for big ships, and so we've always had, before a war, we've always been short of ASW and frigates. We have a lot of anti-air stuff, but our anti-submarine stuff is based on submarines, not on frigates and stuff. But I think we've got it's going to be, like I said, it's not. I'm not saying that this is going to be, but the U.S. Navy has the ability to create a lot of harm. They're good at that, and just like the British Navy, remember what Napoleon asked the Belfron? He asked the captain, "How come you guys, after Trafalgar, how come you guys are so good?" He goes, "We're out here every day, all the weather. We never go home. We're always at sea, and we're good at this." And that's the thing. The Chinese Navy does practice, but they don't go far. They've had that one station off of Somalia, the anti-pirate thing, where they got a couple of destroyers or 2 warships, and they got a logistics ship or 2 to be able to deploy them that far. But that's about. They've never really deployed around the world. You don't see, port visits from Japanese, Chinese carriers and all that stuff. You just don't see it. And remember, the Chinese coastline runs along, Japan runs along a lot of it. And a lot of their heavier ships are up in the north. That's where they keep the carriers, and that's where they do all their training in the northern bases, the northern fleet. So it's not so clear. Now, of course, if the DPRK starts throwing nuclear missiles, I just don't see this as being some kind of quiet, and also depends on who the president is. Xi is probably not going to push on Biden. Would he push on Trump? Trump might or might not, or DeSantis, or who the hell knows. But at some point, the American people are going to go, do we give a damn about Taiwan? Are we going to blow up the world over Taiwan? And that, at some point, that's very much an American. And I don't know if the Canadians would think differently about it, by the way. North America is kind of a nice place. The Mexicans, the Americans, and the Canadians are not going to. We don't worry about attacking each other. That's just not one of our things. Because we're afraid of Canada, so we wouldn't do that. And
we thought we could get to Albany, all the way to Albany, before we'd be noticed.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends in Canada, so we make these jokes all the time. But my only point is that it's how much blood are we going to spill over Taiwan is hard to say, and it depends on when it happens and how it happens. Are we in the middle of an election, or some crazy crap here, or who knows? But Xi, I don't think Xi is doing it tomorrow, and I think Ukraine has given him pause. That's my only view, because he's learned that war is an uncertain thing. It always has been. Anyway, it's right now 9:32. I would just like to, if I can, we got these 3 nice people who have been hanging out. Can we just ask them if they must have at least one question by now? Just make sure they got something.
Yes, Brianna, Julian, Tony, please. If I may, while they're formulating their questions, so you raised 3 important, very important points. You mentioned before discussions about bandwagoning. Could you speculate, again, this is sort of the political dimension of a war game. China's got Pakistan, North Korea, Myanmar, Iran, Russia as allies, right? We're looking at North Korea, and you sort of insinuated there's something going on there.
Remember the Shanghai Cooperation Council? They've also technically got India to some degree, and they also have Iran is in there.
Yeah. And some relations, some sympathetic relations with some of the BRICS, like South Africa and Zimbabwe. So do you see, I mean, again, it's very hard to speculate on the individual characters. Do you see Xi being able to convince Pakistan, North Korea, and Iran to help at the moment of action? Or do you see all of China's allies abandoning them, like, say, fascist Spain abandoned Nazi Germany in World War II? What's your guess on that?
I think the DPRK will be in from day one, because there's no reason for them not to be. I think everybody else is going to take a little bit of a wait and see attitude, because the Chinese can't do too much, hey, the war's starting tomorrow at 2 o'clock kind of stuff. So whatever it is going to be some kind of, intended surprise. If you go to the Michael Howard stuff, one of his conclusions is that strategic surprise is always achieved, because the guy who's doing it creates the conditions for it to happen. And if the conditions aren't exactly right, they just don't do it. And you think that you've successfully thwarted them. But, look how much signaling we did to Putin saying, hey, this is what you're thinking about today. This is what you're thinking about tomorrow. This is what you're doing right now. It didn't matter one whit. He attacked what he wanted to attack, I guess, or one day he finally said, let's go. And, we were maybe not surprised, but, we were kind of disappointed that we couldn't talk him out of being stupid. And in a lot of ways, I'm glad we didn't talk him out of being stupid, because he's now he's now seen as a paper tiger, except for the nuclear weapons. See, the nuclear weapons just changes all of these equations, because you can't win a nuclear war, and he's got plenty of that crap. Now, the only thing I can hope for is that, like the Sting song, do the Russians love their children too? So, I hope that that's the case, so that they don't, somebody says, okay, he's lost it now. We will all be dead if we do what he says, and so we got to do something. So I think I'm hoping there's no, and I've been told many times, hope is not a method. So, but unless somebody can stop it from touching a button at the right time, who knows? So, Julian, Brianna, Tony, any questions? I can go on forever, but I would like to be more relevant to you three, if you're even still on. What I'm worried about is that their computers are on, and they're all having lunch or something somewhere, or dinner, or drinking. Yeah, I don't know.
I'm not sure what time zone they're in.
Yeah, I don't either. So they may not even be here for all I know.
Well, we'll definitely, the moment a question comes up, we'll definitely refer to their questions. So for policymakers, what are the crucial windows they should be looking for based upon your experience of these previous large conflicts? I mean, I'm not entirely clear what was inside Putin's mind when he calculated the timing of the attack on Ukraine, but there are some thoughts that the First World War was dependent on the completion of the Kiel Canal. So are there key things we should be looking for that'll hint at the timing?
Well, ultimately, personally, I was just listening. I do not have a specific question at the moment. That is Julian. I would say that, to your point, when I was working for NATO for many years, when there was still a Cold War, likewise for Brianna, so we only got, so, all right, well, I'm glad you're not, at least hopefully I'm not boring you to death. I would say that, I remember I said it's about logistics. At some point, they have to, over time, and that's what they've been doing with these. Actually, they got to amass the shipping and the munitions and the forces in the right place to go do something, and we will, presumably, we've got a lot of eyes in the sky looking for that. So we'll know when they're capable of doing it. They may be capable of doing it tomorrow. I don't have the intelligence to say they're ready or not. But the one thing that is true, which bothers me, is when an Army and a Navy are training up for something, which they've been doing, you get everybody to a certain, it's like a football team, you get them to the point where you got to put them in the game. It's either you put them in the game or you got to back it down, because you cannot run it up. The equipment, meantime between, the equipment needs, repair and downtime, and, engine parts burn out, and, and so you can only run your force up to that level of readiness. In the Pentagon, I was taught by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, no less, there are three things we spend money on in the Pentagon, right? We spend money on personnel, and that's a big cost. We, besides the Army, pay all that. Then we spend money on new weapon systems, and we spend money on readiness, spare parts, training, all that stuff. And what he's saying is, he said to me was, we can only spend money on two out of the three things, and we always have to spend money on personnel. So you're either trading off new stuff versus readiness. So if the Chinese are getting all ready, they're not building new stuff. I don't think they're better at this than we are. And if they're trained up, that is the easiest thing to fix when you want to. So if they're running these guys up at this point, they're burning through spare parts. They're burning through, people are not sleeping a lot, and and people aren't seeing their, families. You can't do that forever. So at some point, if they don't do it soon, they're not going to do it for a year because they're going to have to stand that thing down, take some lessons learned, think about it some more. I don't know what, but that readiness thing is the thing you watch if you're going down that path.
Yeah, just my observation is that a lot of wars like the Falklands War were actually done remarkably shortly before the conflict initiated. We have a question from Tony, power transition question. When the Chinese economy overtakes the US as the world's largest, do you think this will reshuffle the cards among the world's superpowers?
So, Tony, if you remember the remark I made earlier, I actually think that what's happening now is what you just said is it's not going to happen. I don't think right now I believe the Chinese economy is going to actually lose ground to the US economy. They were on a trajectory that said that they, in a couple of years, by 2030 or something like that, they were going to, some people were saying it already they had the largest economy, but the state-run economy thing that Xi's going for, and the reason I think he's doing it is he fears the rich people. Look at the guy from who is it, Alibaba. He quietly said, okay, they started putting some heat on him. He said, you know what? I got enough money. I don't need this, and I'm getting out of here. So you do whatever you want. And he sold his shares, and he retired and got on his yacht and went somewhere out of China and said, hey, knock yourself out. So I believe that so Tony, what I would say is that first, I don't agree with your supposition. I think that Xi has done everything right now to ensure that that doesn't happen. So I don't think the deck is going to be reshuffled among the world superpowers, but the Chinese are still we're already back into a bipolar world pretty much, I would argue. It's just a matter of time. We're back to and I think we're already in a kind of a new Cold War of sorts with the Chinese. Not quite that bad yet, but I think it's getting there pretty fast. But I actually don't believe that the Chinese economy is going to overtake the US economy because every indicator that goes back 5 years said that. And right now I see nothing. All those things have been their real estate crisis. Their debt is huge, much larger than we thought it was. Going back to a state-run economy, there's no way, there is no historical precedent for a state-run economy like the 5-year plans and all that crap to beat out a capitalism. It's just not going to happen. It's never happened, and there's no reason why it would happen. There's nothing about the brilliance of Xi that he's going to all of a sudden know exactly what levers to pull to get industry going. He can make all the investments in AI he wants and solar power and all this, but if he's running that thing from the top, it will not beat out Europe and the US and Japan. It's just not going to happen. And so I believe that that's not going to happen. So I think Xi is actually, well, he's more dangerous than ever. I think he's actually solving some of our problems.
There's a thought that authoritarian leaders, despite trade relations, and this comes from Dale Copeland, and it explains why Germany attacked their largest trading partner, the British Empire, in 1914, which is the moment they sense that their principal market is building a navy, the clock is ticking, and they think, they have to go with whatever they have available, because if they don't go now, the British Navy is going to blockade the rising German,
yeah, but again, it goes back to, so the German Navy, they wanted to have a certain number of U-boats before they went to war. That was Raiders, Donitz's and Raiders thing. And Hitler was years ahead of when they were going to be ready. Now, the Japanese made a similar calculation saying that right now we're at the height of our power, and the Two Ocean Navy Act of 1934 was already starting to turn out, people forget we started mobilizing almost not quite 10 years, but at 8 years before Pearl Harbor, we were already mobilizing at that point in time industrially. So, so again, I think that for instance, what the British did in the Falklands was very British. I don't know the way to say it. Probably no other country could have pulled it off, although the Americans were giving a lot of quiet support. And if the Argentinians had waited another year, one of those carriers was already going to be scrap metal. I mean, it was the Hermes. One of them was the Hermes, and the Ark Royal or whatever it was. One of them, I think the Hermes was supposed to be scrap. That was the bigger of the two. So, it's just authoritarian. Hitler went when he was ready to go. He didn't care about their armor was, they didn't have that many tanks. They still had mostly horse-drawn artillery. All that there's just a lot of myths about World War II in the beginning that are just not accurate. But you have to read books and to know the difference.
I'm often wondering if people like Hitler or Galtieri of Argentina were primarily afraid of their own population, and the fact that eventually the Germans were like, okay, fine, thank you for getting the trains on time, but next.
Well, actually, there's a really interesting book called Stalin's War, which is really based on that short period in the 1990s when we had access to their archives. So it looks like Stalin. So if one of the things that was always intriguing to me was if you look at an East Front game, I didn't hear the question I would have asked Frank, Chadwick, and it's really come to light to me only in the last couple of years, was when the Germans, Barbarossa goes off. It didn't go well in the South for quite a while, right? They had a lot of problems advancing on Kiev. In fact, they stopped the armor in the north where they were breaking through to try to circle back and deal with Kiev. Well, as it turns out, Stalin was in the process of a large military buildup to launch an offensive towards Germany. He was getting ready to attack Hitler. So that's a little detail, and that's where all their armor was. So he had amassed all this armor in the South. And when you play a Barbarossa game, you realize that look where all the tanks are. It's down here in the Ukraine. That's where all the tanks were. And it's really hard for the Germans to deal with. They have tanks, but there's plenty of Russian tanks too. They're not as they're not as well organized at all. But there's a lot of tanks, a lot of mechanized stuff down in the South. And that's because that's where he was building up a big attack. He was going to go into Romania and Bulgaria. He's going to attack Romania and then into Poland and to push the Germans back because he's going to get. Their relationship was starting to break down badly, and Stalin, being the paranoid boy that he was, said, "I might as well punch him in the face before he punches me in the face," and Hitler just beat him to the punch. So I don't think that narrative is even accurate.
No, I mean, I of course I've played Third Reich quite a few times and have tried to create the peace on the Eastern Front so you can focus on England and France. But of course, that is it's a game, an abstraction. Yeah. But so we have less than 15 minutes. So I have to apologize because your insights are so fascinating because of your professional time in government. But in 14 minutes, what should we do if we were to attempt to come up with on the realistic side of a war game, a playable war game in the commercial sphere? I know obviously I think you might have one in the works, so we don't necessarily want you to divulge any trade secrets, but what should we
I don't care about that.
Like
so
hex
Taiwan,
sizes,
we're talking about Taiwan now, right?
Yeah, hex sizes, CRT,
let's just back up a little bit. So let's make it. You said a simple game, so let's talk simple. So let's say that you've got a total of 5 spaces. How about that? I got the China coast, I got the Straits, I got the South China Sea, I've got the Sea of Japan, and I got kind of like the approaches through the Philippines, and then I got sort of the rest of the world, coming into that little drill. So I'd want to know who controls the sea and airspace at any given time. Is it uncontested, or so? I'd like to know who's in charge of that space, and then if I control the sea and airspace over the strait, I can just move my guys from China into Taiwan. Yeah, there's some losses, roll some dice. I don't really care what you do, but I get ashore. If I do get ashore, I have to monitor, can I keep that control? So that's the, how viable are my forces on Taiwan, given that I can fly stuff in, but as we know, you can only, if I can shoot down the planes or make that difficult, that's going to be a problem. If I can't get merchant ships across with stuff, I can get a bunch of lighters, small craft bringing, bread and stuff, but that's not going to keep an army, going. And then and then I need to know the cohesion of Taiwan as a country and as an army, how cohesive, and can we supply them? Can we get in the other side with stuff to them? And I think that is the fundamental, and at the point where one side can't supply itself on the island, that's when I would start to say they're going to start to lose. And then what are you going to, and that's also the escalation. What are they going to do to change that? So that's the real battle to me. And that's just 5 spaces. But if I understand that, the ground forces, the Chinese are always going to have sufficient ground forces to feed in. I mean, there's a lot of Chinese guys. I mean, the one family policy screwed up the natural order of nature. They've got a lot of they got a lot of boys that don't have girls, so they don't care. They'll throw them in there and say the girls are over there. I mean, and I know that sounds terrible, but believe me, that's not the first time in history that that's been sort of like the underlying story. I read a horrible article about there's an entire a trade in girls from Myanmar. They get roped into coming to do waitress jobs in China, but ultimately they get, it's human trafficking under, there's human trafficking. These men are looking for girls, and there's all sorts of nasty things going on with some of these client countries. And so, believe me, hey, look, there's a lot of girls over there. So these boys are going to go. I mean, just based on that, I mean, that's really ugly stuff, but that's kind of how these things work at that point.
Yeah, even the non-ugly side, 25% of the wives in South Korean rural areas are not South Korean, and there's a language education issue. And
where do they come from? Where do they come from?
No, precisely the area you identified, Southeast Asia. But I mean, obviously, I don't think it's that nefarious. But for South Korea, it's a major cultural issue, obviously.
Well, with the internet, I mean, I keep blocking them, but I keep getting these things. I'm an old white guy. I keep, Ukrainian girls looking for boyfriends. It's like, I'm married for 44 years. Give me a break. So, but aside from all that, I think it's like a logistics cohesion thing. If the Taiwanese government can keep Taiwan in a similar state to Ukraine, where they're going to stay, we're going to fight this out, and we can maintain a supply line. This is a long war. If the Chinese can block us out, and keep themselves in, they will prevail in about 6 months.
But you raised earlier the issue of the sensors in Ukraine. So what does air superiority or absence of look like now when it's so difficult to get rid of every drone flying over the China Sea?
Remember, drones don't have big range. So in Ukraine, I got a front line that I can get 3 guys and a couple of drones within, I seen on the news, I can see a situation where they're a mile away, there's Russians from where the news guys are sitting with their cameras. You can't really see anybody, but they said the Russians are over in those buildings over there. Okay, so a drone can fly that far. I don't know many those little drones that can fly 100 miles. The battery, you can't fly a drone 100 miles across the strait. You're going to need real planes for that. So you can't get close enough. Now the little drone could work on the island, which would give advantage to the Taiwanese, but you're going to need air, and you need air power to keep the the ships, and how many. My point is, how many mines can we dump into the strait and around the island? I mean, you can make that pretty. Modern mines are pretty damn effective. And shooting down big cargo aircraft is not that hard if you can get anywhere within range of them.
Sorry, I don't mean to imperil your piece, but wading into the U.S. Marine Corps debate.
Which debate?
Well, I think the U.S. Marine Corps is considering decentralizing and essentially creating much smaller units capable of intervening in the South China Sea. And I mean, as I've seen it, the debates going online, the traditional Marine Corps has a faith in the use of artillery, and they don't think very expensive missiles will be wasted on targets of opportunity. And the current Marine Corps command wants to have these much smaller. I'm not sure if it's a platoon or sort of company-sized organizations with their own drones, with their own rocket artillery. Some are calling it a crazy transformation, but I think the principle is that they're going to create these small, highly decentralized organizations capable of seizing the islands along the Filipino, Taiwanese littoral, and the South China Sea.
So first off, in a world of artillery, see, you know what a beaten zone is on artillery? So the last thing you want to do is put a lot of people into a beaten zone, right? You're just going to get more. The modern artillery will say this hectare is going to be blown the garbage, and the best way to survive that is not be there. So having a lot of guys masked up with headquarters, so what I think they're starting to say is, again, I have to see the analysis, but if you look at any book, is that over time, since the beginning of time, the force to space ratio is getting smaller because the weapons, the weapons are so lethal that, if I remember my joke about the Ford dealership in terrorist countries. If I can get more guys into the car, my one missile is going to kill more guys. So the answer is don't have a lot of guys in the car. You'll cut your casualties down. So, but the problem with a small force is it's got to have access to long-range firepower. That we've been playing with that stuff in the Pentagon since the beginning of time. Small, and it works. By the way, we've actually demonstrated in real wars that if you give a small unit a good radio with the right access to sensors and the ability to do what I call local force protection, and not in a big way, you can bring holy hell down on somebody with long-range fires. So that's true, but holding ground ultimately requires boots. And if it's a small island, yeah, I could get away with it maybe, but you're not putting, 28 fire teams into Taiwan. You're going to stop the Chinese. That's just not going to happen. So you're going to have, real combat power that can be dug in, boots on the ground, ultimately to hold on to it. Now, you can leverage the Taiwanese boots by us doing more of the Green Beret training, backing them up stuff. That I can totally see, using the indigenous armies and making them far more effective is one of our hallmarks. In fact, the entire littoral ship program was built around that idea. I mean, we looked at a situation in Colombia where all we had to do was send one littoral ship in with a machine shop, and we could triple the marine capability of Colombia just by fixing the engines. So maintenance in in countries is very uneven. If we could just do that alone, we can make people more effective on their own. That's the force multiplier, and I can see that being the Marines doing that is part of their doctrine. But ultimately, you're going to have to put some amount of ground force that can actually take a position by assault, or you don't have really much capability.
Could I ask you to pass judgment on an article I wrote in the National Interest in which I argued that the survival of Taiwan would depend on the US's diplomacy with the Philippines? If we get the air bases in northern Luzon, Taiwan will last forever. And if China somehow neutralizes the Philippines, and if I agree with you, I think Guam and Okinawa can't possibly provide for their own defense and provide support to Taiwan. What do you think of that conjecture?
So the truth here is a U.S. aircraft carrier cannot sustain high intensity operations for more than about a week, 10 days, maybe 2 weeks if they're really good. And they're going to have to stand down. So the only way to oppose an invasion of Taiwan over any length of time is going to have to be land-based air power. However, every one of those air bases in northern Philippines is I can find it on a spot. We could go buy a picture of it tomorrow, and all of it was Pari and what used to be Clark Air Base and Visay, and all those places are well within missile range from lots of places that China owns. So the ability, if we're operating combat aircraft out of the Philippines, I don't see how the Chinese let that, if the Chinese let us operate them and shoot them down, okay, yeah, that would work. But I think fixed air bases that close into those missiles is just not going to be viable. So if Okinawa is not viable, northern Philippines is not viable either. And the question is going to be is how our ability to generate from further over the horizon firepower. Believe it or not, there was a whole debate with the United States Air Force about bringing back we haven't had the B-2 was a very specific kind of bomber for a very specific purpose. B-52s are older than I am, and B-1s are actually quite effective but they're getting old, you know, and they're old. So we haven't had a new bomber that would really help us in a long time. And that's really the kind of system that actually could help, because the Chinese missiles can't fire unless they're going to start using ICBMs. What about the B-21? So is the B-21 a new kind of bomber that I'm not aware of that they're working on?
I think they put it on display a week ago, but I missed the show.
How many are they going to build?
Yeah, Julian, do you know?
I do not. Well, let's see. You know, we can figure this out real quick. So here, this is the internet age, right? So I used to do this with my classes with all the young kids. So B-21 with the stealth bomber.
And normally I have my students also check it in the middle of class.
How many? I haven't. How many B-21 stealth bomber to be built? Let's see what we get an answer real quick.
Professor Herman, I thought you could just conjure them up like you did for the you did for us.
Oh, there's a Wikipedia saying, this is really just a I guarantee we're not building a lot of these. They're not going to release the estimated cost, which must be really embarrassing. Remember, I worked on the Save the Whale program, which is the B2. Northrop Grumman won the contract. It's going to be built in California. Thank you.
Julian says it's expected to enter service in 2026, 2027, which is actually not that long.
Not too far away, but I'm looking for how many. So they built 6 so far. We're going to see it for the first time in December. They're going to unveil it.
They pushed it forward. Okay.
Yeah, I don't have a number. That's the big news. See, so remember, we have 21. We had 21 B2s. Now we have 19. 19 B2s is nice, but that's not going to, win a war against China. B21s, you need like 100. Can they build? Will they build 100 of something that costs the amount of an aircraft carrier? I don't know.
Huge questions. Professor Herman, thank you so much. I mean, this was a 3-hour marathon, and I still have 2 pages of questions. We spoke yesterday about what were my questions, and I was tongue-tied. But I came up with so many questions that were never answered. It just shows you how much work you've done. And I mean, you can see behind me how many of your war games take up shelf space. I mean, and of course, you mentioned it several times. We did not speak about all of the classic era war games that you designed and your insight of that whole period, which is, of course, fascinating and would be a whole separate interview on its own. So again, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Brianna, Tony, and Julian. Nice not talking to you, but hearing your questions. Take care.